The stories. What stayed behind in this motel room window? The room was standard: two beds, a humming wall unit, and a window that faced the parking lot where big rigs idled through the night. What didn't look standard, once the sun rose low and flat, was the faint writing that only appeared across the glass at a shallow angle backward, patchy, like a message scrubbed hard but not gone. Rhea Mallory, 37, an insurance field adjuster on a week of hail damage claims, noticed it as she packed. She had meant to drink the motel's thin coffee, make two calls, and hit the interstate before the heat came up. The plan wobbled when the gold light caught on the pane and stitched a sentence out of streaks. She leaned close. Three words. Reversed, as if intended for someone outside. The first resolved quickest. He. The second took longer. What? The first resolved quickest. He. The second took longer. Was. The third broke into stuttered islands before joining. Here. Rhea didn't trust hunches for work, but she did trust her eyes. The glass held something that wanted to stay. She touched the pane with her knuckle, careful not to smear. The letters were not marker or paint. They looked like oil lifts, the kind that come from fingers pressed to a clean surface, then wiped without full success. Years of photographing dent patterns and windshield webs had made her look for directionality, downstrokes, stopping points. The H's verticals were heavier at the top. Somebody had reached up to write it. The height matched a kid, maybe a small teenager, maybe someone standing on a heel. The backward presentation meant whoever wrote it had been inside the room, not out in the lot. Rhea stepped back, then forward again, catching the angle to reread. He was here. It wasn't much by itself. Still, it clicked against something she half remembered. A flyer she'd seen in a gas station along this same highway, western Nevada. A wide run of sage and salt flat about a kid who had vanished years ago, last seen near an old roadside motel. The details on the flyer had been faded and generalized, and she hated the feeling of turning strangers into puzzles. But the message on the glass wouldn't let go. She snapped a photo, then another with the curtain pulled halfway to throw side shadow. Insurance habit. She set her phone on the sill and made a line in her notebook: room 23, north building, roadside motel, off the state route, near the truck stop, morning light from the east. She added the date in her own style, early September of 2011, because she'd learned that memory softens the edges of time. Down at the front desk, a man with the posture of a coiled garden hose slid a receipt across the counter. He wore a shirt with a stitched name: Denton Kroll, property manager. He had the long stare of someone who had solved the same small problems for too many seasons. Rhea mentioned the window, casual like it was a maintenance note. Cleaning streaks, Kroll said. Windex when the sun hits. He tapped the desk with a capped pen. Happens. Could be, she said. It looks like words, though. Backward, like someone wrote from inside. People do all kinds of things to glass, he said, not looking up. Kids breathe and draw hearts. Guests leave handprints. Our crew wipes it down. Since when have you managed this place? Rhea asked. Still casual. Late 2000s, he said. Before that, it was old Mr. Levitt's. He let things slide. We've replaced a lot of panes, Truth told. He would not say more, and she didn't push. It wasn't her business. She was there for roof photos and the dent farm on a fleet of sedans. But curiosity has a way of hiring a seat beside duty. Back in the room, she stood the motel stationary on edge to catch more oblique light. The letters resolved again. She took a slow breath, then put her phone on voice memo, not to narrate, just to capture the ambient hum and her measures. A trick a photographer had taught her to anchor memory later. The air smelled like old cleaner and the metal tang of the window track. Her internal clue came by accident. When she slid the curtain fully open, the bottom hem snagged on a plastic spacer in the aluminum frame.
The spacer was cracked, held with a sliver of old tape. The tape wore a different sheen than the rest of the frame, brittle amber with torn fibers pressed into it. On top of that tape, ground into the glue, lay a tiny fleck of blue wax, the kind cheap crayons leave. Someone had taped something in place, maybe a page, maybe a label long enough for wax to settle. It matched the backward writing. If a sign had ever been stuck there, it would read correctly to the room. She wrapped the little tape shard in the motel stationery, not as evidence she wasn't law enforcement, but because it felt wrong to leave it to a vacuum head. She took macro shots of the frame, the spacer, the wax fleck, and the area of glass where the words showed best. Then she checked out, turned in her key card, and drove to the first claim 2 towns over. She told herself it would end there. It didn't. At lunch in a diner with counter stools and a corkboard of lost puppies and church suppers, she asked the waitress if the motel had any stories. The waitress, thin braid, name tag reading, Paloma rolled her eyes. Depends on your appetite, Paloma said. Folks, stop, sleep, leave. Years back, a trooper sat there with coffee for a week straight. Didn't say why, just watched the door. Remember when? Ria asked. Late 90s? Maybe early 2000s? Paloma said. Time fuzzes. He had a name like Otero, or something like that. People said a kid was missing. No one talked specifics. Ria looked at her phone photos again in the car. He was here. She tried to leave it alone. That night, at another motel 2 counties away, she gave in and called the number on a public information page she found for the State Highway Patrol. A desk officer forwarded her to a sergeant who handled cold inquiries. She left a measured voicemail, using evidence terms that felt correct to her station. I'm calling about a motel window in Western Nevada. Room 23, North Building. There's old oil-lifted writing that reads, "He was here," when viewed at an oblique angle. There's also tape residue with blue crayon wax embedded in a spacer on the frame. I'm not asserting anything, just saw it, photographed it, and thought it might matter if there were any archived calls tied to that property. A day later, a woman called back, voice steady, words spare. She introduced herself as Sergeant Mara Vickery. Rhea put her on speaker and laid out exactly what she'd seen in order. Vickery didn't indulge or discourage. She asked for the photos and the exact position of the room relative to the parking lot. She also asked about the condition of the glass scratches, chips, or a logo in the corner that would indicate the manufacturer and tempering date. Rhea checked. The corner carried a faint etched mark. She had to tilt it hard to read. She wrote it down. Vickery hummed. The way someone does when a thing aligns with a file in memory? Here's what we have, reportedly, Vickery said. In late spring of 1999, a teenage boy traveling with extended family was reported missing along that corridor. Last confirmed sighting was a convenience store, 2 exits from your motel. Dispatch logs note a search and a hotel canvas. Witness statements varied. No sign. The case is cold, not active. We do not discuss names. Her tone made a boundary plain without being harsh. I'm not asking for any names, Ria said. I can send you everything. One more thing, there's a crack in the plastic spacer on the frame that's been taped over for a long time. The tape is ambered. There's blue crayon wax ground into it that felt like it was from inside, not outside. Copy that, Vickery said. Send what you have. Rhea sent the photos with a short note. She expected silence. Instead, Vickery called again the next afternoon. The mark you read on the glass etching is interesting, the sergeant said. It indicates the glass was manufactured in 2003. The motel you stayed in? Our old notes suggest it had original panes at the time of the search in 1999. So, if the panel in room 23 was replaced sometime after 2003, whatever writing you saw could predate that replacement only if transferred in some way. More likely, the writing was made after 2003. Meaning the message came later than the disappearance? Rhea said. Most likely, Vickery said. This isn't a TV turn. It doesn't solve anything. But it revises assumptions about timeline and occupancy. It suggests someone connected, or someone who wanted us to think they were connected, came back to that room after 2003. We would need maintenance records to know exactly when the glass went in. It made sense, and it did not hand her any drama. It did offer direction. Rhea drove back after her last claim and asked for Kroll again. She didn't pretend she had authority. She did not hint at leverage. She simply showed the macro photo of the etching and the cracked spacer and asked if he had any records on window replacements. Kroll rubbed his jaw as if checking for new bones. We replaced a batch after a wind event, he said. Glass was whistling. I'll look. He returned with a gray file folder crusted with Post-its. Inside sat stapled invoices with dates in the margins. Early August of 2007, Units 12 through 24, North Building. Supplier, Lima's Glass Service. Installer initials? You mind if I photograph these? Rhea asked. Knock yourself out, Kroll said, and for the first time he looked tired in a way that wasn't irritated, just human. The external confirmation came when Rhea called the number on one of the old invoices and got a man answering on the second ring. Limas, he said. Hector speaking. He remembered the job. Long run of aluminum frames that had gone chalky from sun, Hector Limas said. We swapped panes and spacers where needed. I had to rig a few things because the sill channels were bent. We didn't touch curtains. New tempered glass, stamped 2003 because that's what the distributor had bulk. Do you remember room 23? Rhea asked, knowing the question was broad and that memory is a wide net. Vaguely, he said. I remember one where the inside of the glass looked fingerprinted even after cleaning. We assumed someone had handled the pane before it cured. The housekeeper complained the smears came back in certain light. We used ammonia. It didn't fully lift. That's not unusual. Oils can ghost. Did you ever see writing in the oil? She asked. Could've, he replied. I don't read windows for stories. We replaced what was cracked. You're talking ghosts. They happen. If you think it's more, tell the troopers. She had already done that. She thanked him and wrote his comments down exactly, adding reportedly and remembered vaguely, because precision and humility can keep a story honest. Over the next week, Rhea kept doing her real job, hail dents, roof lines, signature blocks, while she let the window gather its own weight. The sergeant called one more time to say they had pulled the motel's old work orders. The pane in room 23 had been replaced in early August of 2007, matching the invoice. Maintenance logs around that month showed a housekeeping note. Writing keeps showing on 23 window. Tried vinegar. Still shows in morning. That note was funneled through a retired dispatcher named Sella Winters, who had saved a cardboard banker's box of old shift printouts the way certain people keep the world from slipping because they know it tries. A quiet logic emerged. The boy missing from 1999 and there was never a name spoken could not have written he was here on a piece of glass installed 8 years later, unless he returned. That didn't guarantee that he had. The message could have been a relational echo, a cousin, a friend, someone marking grief. But the tape shard and the wax fleck told another piece. The blue wax had come from a cheap crayon, likely pressed while paper was taped inside the frame. That suggested a small person sitting there, drawing, or someone steadied a page while trying to line up letters against the glass. The residue was on the inside spacer, not outside. That meant a moment happened in the room, not on the lot. Vickery asked a small favor that Rhea could do without crossing lines. Return to the room and try to lift a better photograph with crosslight. Rhea booked herself back into the motel on her own dime at the tail end of a loop. She requested 23 and got it after a shrug from Kroll. She came prepared with nothing fancy, just a black foam board to bounce light and a cheap angled flashlight from a hardware store. When the first edge of sun moved off the far hills, the letters bloomed again. She fixed the angle with books and the foam board, then took a series at different exposures. In two of them, a smudge sat low and right, below the third word, barely a mark unless you expected it. It looked like a short curve with two dots and a drag. Rhea stared until she understood what shape it wanted to be. A crude smiley face, the kind drawn in 3 seconds by distracted hands. In the room notebook, decades old, Sella Winters had jotted a dispatch aside in 1999 that mentioned the kid's habit of drawing quick smiley faces in margins when nervous, according to a teacher's comment taken by phone. That was not proof. It was a soft echo between two separate things. Still, the echo categorized itself as relevant. When Rhea sent the new images, Vickery didn't tell her it solved anything. She said, this tightens the inference that whoever made the marks had knowledge of the kid's habits or was the kid. It also keeps the time frame post 2003. At this point, the facts that remained were simple. A pane installed in early August of 2007 kept showing lifted writing when morning light hit right. Housekeeping noticed. The content read, "He was here," and, in some readings, a simple face below. Tape residue and a crayon fleck lived on the interior spacer. Maintenance logs matched the install. A glazier remembered ghosted oils. Dispatch logs from 1999 contained an aside about a kid's doodles. None of that made a clean line to cause. It did what good detail does. It removed a few wrong lines. The twist, quiet but firm, landed 2 months later, not for Rhea's benefit and not with fanfare. Vickery called to let her know that, in reviewing archived calls surrounding the motel, a short anonymous tip from late summer of 2007 had been found. The caller, whose voice was masked by the crush of a payphone, had said only, "Check the north building, second floor, room by the ice machine. Mornings show messages." The number had been a dead end then. The note sat in the file without connection because no one had compared it to the install logs. Now they matched. The pane had just been replaced. The message, then, could not be a relic from before the disappearance. It was a marker laid down later, possibly by someone who had returned to a familiar place to say something without saying much at all. Rhea asked the only question she could. "Does this help?" "It helps me not waste time on a wrong year," Vickery said. "Sometimes that's the whole gain." And that was it. No chase, no doors kicked. Instead, a timeline corrected by what stayed behind in a motel room window. Rhea didn't tell the story to anyone who would make it into a campfire shock. She kept the tape shard in a small envelope with the word motel and the date in her hand, even though she knew it had no chain of custody value. It wasn't evidence for court, it was gravity for memory. On her last pass through that stretch of highway before winter, she pulled into the truck stop at dusk and watched the north building of the motel throw its square lights into the lot. The window of room 23 held the look of any other. A woman in a denim jacket let down the blinds. A kid ran past, dragging a suitcase that clicked over seams. None of them knew what the glass had whispered. That felt right. A real story refuses to belong to whoever tells it the loudest. Rhea stood there until the sodium lamps came up and turned everything the same, tired amber. The hum of diesel engines filled the air, the kind of sound that flattens thought. She thought briefly of the words someone had pressed there with damp fingers and of the faint, silly face below. Not testimony, not confession, just a note at the exact height of a small person trying to leave proof of a breath. The truth in it was not the grand kind. It was the modest, late kind, the kind that lets people who do this work say later, with care, that a thing likely happened in a different month than everyone thought, and that a pane of glass, replaced in early August of 2007, had kept those mornings honest for years. She drove away without looking back, because looking back is for when there's nothing left to file. The motel settled into the dark, the windows settled into shadow, and whatever stayed behind stayed there, just oil, just light, just enough. The stories. Dispatcher who redialed a night number years later. The call that woke the overnight desk never finished cleanly, and the number that hung up stayed burned into memory. The report marked it as an incomplete welfare check request, and the audio ended right after a sharp breath. Leora Vance worked nights at a regional communications center, 36, steady voice, quick notes, routine coffee. She covered a patchwork of small towns around a river, and her goal that night was simple and ordinary. She wanted to make it through the shift with clean logs, then drive home before sunrise. At 2:43, the line flashed unknown number, and a woman whispered that somebody was on the porch. The voice cracked like cold glass, and static clipped the rest, so Leora asked the normal questions. The call died mid-sentence, and the return attempt fed a busy tone that rolled like a slow alarm. Protocol said, log it, dispatch a unit, and move forward with the map. She sent 2 cars across county lines, and she wrote porch contact unknown female, possible prowler, audio cutout. The officers found a silent street and a door light, and the porch camera showed only a moth. The address did not match the call trace, which often happened with rural switches. The closest relevant record was a break-in from 1998, and the same street used to be named differently on paper maps. The officers cleared without contact, and Leora filed it under incomplete with a notation on poor signal. She replayed the clip during the quiet hour before dawn, and she heard a faint tone behind the voice. She had a habit of catching tiny sounds people missed, and she logged them like breadcrumbs for later check. The tone matched the alert from older medical pendants, according to an equipment chart in her drawer. 2 days later, the number could not be connected, and the carrier reported a recycled pool of lines. A supervisor closed the incident as resolved by patrol presence, and life returned to the ordinary rhythm of alarms and traffic. Leora drove home through thin drizzle and told herself to let the record settle. Years slid by with new software and different chairs, and Leora moved into training and quality checks. She taught new dispatchers to separate panic from facts and to trust logs more than late-night adrenaline. She kept a notebook of unresolved lines, a quiet ledger of what the radio called ghosts. In 2005, a county audit required purging old tapes, and Leora requested the call as a training sample. She argued that the tape showed how to verify address data when signals bounced, and the review board agreed to preserve it. She placed the audio in a folder for classroom use, then forgot it for a while. In 2017, the center switched to digital recording with automatic transcription for flagged words. The legacy folder ported into the new system, and the software saw porch and pendant, then tagged it for quality review. Leora listened again and heard the same faint tone, which still felt wrong and unfinished. She noticed a rhythm behind the static, and it repeated every 6 seconds with small variants. A trainee suggested a smoke detector chirp, but the pattern felt too mechanical for a battery warning. Leora wrote a new note, and she marked it as likely device signal not from residents. A retired technician stopped by for coffee and heard the clip through an open speaker. He said the beeping sounded like a hallway alarm from a care facility, and the pitch matched certain wall units. He gave a rough model name from years earlier, and he shrugged in that cautious way field techs learn. Witness statements in older town council minutes mentioned a small facility that closed in 2006. The building sat at the edge of a service road near the river, and the license lapsed after staff shortages. The address never showed in the dispatch mapping tool, which favored current businesses and active residences. Leora searched archived calls around that road and found short bursts from unknown lines that year. Each clip cut off before a name, and the patrol responses found nothing but chained doors and dust. A maintenance crew had watched the property for a bank, according to one officer report from spring. She pulled tax records from the county site and found a change of ownership in 2007. The building title shifted to a holding company, which often meant redevelopment, which never came. A satellite photo showed a roof with patched squares and a light pole that leaned toward the access lane. The night number from the porch call mapped to a carrier block once used inside institutions. A policy note in an old binder described internal extensions that could overflow to outbound lines when certain failsafes trip. It was not proof, but it lined up with what the technician had described over coffee. She visited the records room on her lunch and requested dispatch logs for that road after 2006. The clerk pulled a slim folder with dust, and the sheets listed trespass checks requested by neighbors. No violent incidents were recorded, and most notes referenced animals and teens daring each other. A faded memo said interior power was cut to code years ago, and alarms were disconnected with a certificate. The memo was initialed by a contractor who later moved out of state, according to a local paperclip. The paper mentioned a minor zoning fight over repurposing, which stalled and faded. A rumor in a neighborhood forum referenced late-night lights near the loading door, reportedly seen by a delivery driver. The driver claimed to hear a tone like a distant truck backup and then nothing after he blinked his high beams. The forum thread ended with jokes, and the administrator locked it after a week. Leora requested permission to run a courtesy check by phone on the legacy carrier block. She wrote that the new system showed occasional pings from inactive numbers, and she wanted to verify with the provider. The provider sent a bland letter that said non-billable pings could reflect maintenance checks, which proved little. She let it go again until 2021, when a cold storm knocked power around much of the valley. The center fielded hundreds of calls for downed lines and trees, and unknown numbers flooded the switch when cell towers failed. The old number flashed across a test screen, and a note in red tagged it as historic. It hit her in the middle of managing a pile of alarms, and she felt the odd gravity of unfinished work. Her trainee, a quiet analyst named Matteo Greer, saw her stare and asked what history followed that line. She explained the porch call, the tone, the closed facility, and the recurring pings during outages. He suggested a careful redial during low traffic hours, which fit policy when no private party would be disturbed. The number technically did not belong to a person, and the facility was listed as vacant in tax files. The watch commander noted no risk and approved a controlled test with recording flagged as training. At 3:10 the next night, Leora sat with Matteo in a side room and pressed redial on a clean console. The ring returned at a low volume, and a relay clicked before a voice picked up with a machine crawl. The voice said, "Reception desk. Please hold." The line stayed open with air and faint humming. Leora spoke carefully, and she used the generic script for a wellness verification at an inactive site. The line did not respond like normal interactive voice response, and the hum rose, then settled like heating vents. Matteo pointed to the waveform on the screen, and he traced a stair step that pulsed in threes. She said the center needed to verify status for a safety audit, and could a staff member confirm the building as empty. The voice returned with a single word, and it sounded like census, which made no sense for a desk. The hum changed to a thinner tone, and something clicked like a phone being set down. They stayed quiet, and a tiny echo carried an off-room sound that resembled elevator chimes. The building never had an elevator, according to the old permit in the zoning files, which listed 2 floors only. The chime could have been something else, or a bleed from another source through a carrier trunk. The call lasted 2 minutes, and then a hard click ended it with no final acknowledgement or goodbye. Leora logged every detail with exact time and the conditions of the room, plus the fact that a second console witnessed. She wrote that the voice felt recorded, but not like a standard system recording from that era. A next step followed policy, which said request a daytime site check with property access if possible. The sheriff office called the management company, which reported that the interior phones were long removed with certification. A maintenance vendor met deputies at noon, and the group entered through a side door with a stubborn hinge. They found clean air, paint flakes, and a smell like dry paper after long storage. No phones sat on desks, and no wiring hung from ceilings beyond bundled tubes cut and capped. A panel in the back room had a line of dead indicators, and a label from 2006 named the contractor. A back storage closet held a metal cabinet for telecom terminations, and inside a single light glowed green. The maintenance vendor said the light probably fed from a battery pack, which should have died many years earlier. He pulled the pack, and the light stayed green, which made him raise his eyebrows without a word. They traced the last live wire through conduit to a junction box near the loading door by the ramp. The box led to an old underground line that likely connected to a central office by the highway. The vendor said a ghost loop could be holding a stub signal, which might ring when jolted by storms. The explanation fit enough to calm nerves, and it gave the watch commander a line to give any curious council member. Leora filed the daytime result and waited for the routine to end, but her notebook felt heavier than before. She wanted something cleaner, a line that tied the porch call to a person. She checked archived calls for names near the facility in late 2005, and a surname appeared twice. The name belonged to a kitchen worker who reportedly stayed late to clean and who left town soon after closure. A short article from a community paper mentioned a farewell potluck in a church hall. A social post from years later showed a small photo of a medal on a refrigerator and a caption about nights that never end. The account had poor privacy settings, and it linked to a page for a caretaker group that offered mutual aid. The group had a public list of contacts, and one number matched the surname. She called during the afternoon from a staff phone and explained she was a dispatcher reviewing a historic alarm. The woman who answered identified herself as the former cook, and she said the night phones were a mess back then. She remembered plugging a line into a wall to ask for help during a snow night, then hanging up fast. The year matched the period before closure, and the memory included a porch light that never switched off correctly. The cook said a hallway alarm sometimes tripped when wind hit the wheelchairs stacked near an exit door. She said a pendant kept calling the desk after the resident moved, and staff joked about it. Leora asked if anyone had used an emergency night number taped under a desk, and the woman hesitated, then said maybe. She said an old laminated card listed a direct outside line for after hours when the main switch froze. She added that the card got lost during a water leak, and the sticker glue ruined 2 drawers. The detail matched a photo in the zoning files that showed bubbled plywood under a window near the desk. The water issue provided another path for odd faults, which could keep a line limping and ring when power fluctuated. The cook promised to look through an old box for any scraps, and she promised nothing more. Days later, an envelope arrived addressed to the center with no return, and inside lay half a laminated card. The text read, "Night number for direct line. Use only if house phones fail." The bottom showed 6 digits with 2 missing. The plastic edge was cracked, and a brown stain cut through the second line. Leora held the fragment near the recording console and felt the story settle into a shape that made sense. The porch call likely came from a staffer trying to poke through a dead switch, and the tone was the hallway alarm. The number carried forward through bureaucratic leftovers, and it rang when the storm hit the loop. She still needed the humane piece. The person whose whisper said someone was on the porch that night. She checked weather records for a cold snap that matched the reported snow night, and the timeline met the audit note. A dispatch log from the same week showed a trespass call at a different address with no contact. The officer who filed that trespass had retired to a nearby town, and he answered his landline on a sunny afternoon. He remembered a night when snow fell like ash and radios kept picking up carrier noise. He also remembered stopping near the old facility entrance, then leaving after seeing only footprints of a stray dog. He did not remember any porch lights, but he said the small homes nearby sometimes used helper bulbs that never slept. He also said staff from the facility used to walk to a bus stop at 4 in the morning after night shifts. The whisper could have been a staffer leaving alone, worried by a shape on the ramp. The theory fit and did no harm, and it honored the boundary between records and stories. Leora wrote a final entry into the training file, and she summarized the chain of evidence with careful language. She used reportedly and dispatch logs and witness statements, and she added the laminated card as a scanned appendix. Before she closed it, she redialed the night number one last time to satisfy the part of her that wanted symmetry. The line clicked into a dead tone for 3 slow breaths, then released a single chime in silence. She sat still, then pressed stop and saved the recording with a title that matched her steady heart. She did not post about it, and she did not share more than the classroom frame. The work of nights is often this quiet, a puzzle solved just enough to let people sleep. On her drive home, she watched a porch light fade behind a tree line and let the road carry the rest away. The stories. Why this motel room safe changed everything. They called it a budget motel along a long highway spur where road dust gathered in corners and secrets settled quietly. The room safe in number 12 looked ordinary enough, powder-coated steel with a keypad that beeped politely at tired travelers. Lyle Garza woke before sunrise on a Tuesday, 38 years old, and working claims for a regional insurer. He had driven 3 hours to meet a policyholder whose pickup had burned behind the old diner, and he wanted clean paperwork today. He checked into the motel first, showered fast, then laid out forms on the dresser, careful about matching VIN digits and timestamps. His plan was simple: wrap the inspection before lunch, then circle back for photos and voice notes after the truck release. He liked driving while the day still felt open, and he told himself the assignment would be routine and forgettable. It had been forgettable until the manager knocked. 2 quick raps, then a pause heavy enough to make him frown. Mara Quintero stood in the doorway with a clipboard, 34, managing rooms and payroll while raising her nephew after school. She asked if he had heard the beeps from the safe, because front desk saw brief power spikes last night. Lyle said he had not used the safe, and she nodded, eyes moving toward the keypad like someone checking a stove twice. Maintenance had logged an odd complaint the previous afternoon. Reportedly, a guest in 12 claimed the safe ate his wallet. The man left before checkout, promising to call the card companies, and a note in the margin said possible intoxication. Mara said housekeeping later pulled the bedding and found a small metal tool near the baseboard. Lyle picked up the tool carefully with a tissue, a thin square of steel with a notch like a feeler gauge. He set it on the desk with his forms, then opened his voice recorder, speaking in that steady tone he used for field notes. He described the room, the safe brand, the tool, and the time on the microwave clock because simple details held steady on lonely days. Mara asked if he knew how to clear the safe code since the master sheet had gone missing during renovations last winter. He did not, but he knew the trick of powering off consumer locks, which could flip hidden defaults, according to a warehouse supervisor he once interviewed. He unplugged the mini fridge, found the breaker panel behind a painting, then asked permission to shut the room briefly. They stood in the doorway while the lights flickered and the highway hummed like a restless air conditioner beyond the lot. He waited 10 seconds, restored power, then tapped the keypad with a ballpoint, feeling silly and a little curious. The safe beeped twice in a lower tone, which he recognized from a training video about apartment lockouts, reportedly used by traveling warranty teams. He tried a factory code that someone had once mumbled during a fire inspection, and the safe chirped, green light winking. The door opened an inch against a sticky seal, and Mara let out a nervous laugh, surprised and worried in equal measure. Inside sat a clear zipper pouch with a folded receipt, a motel keycard from another town, and a small black voice recorder. He found a driver loyalty card attached to the receipt, and he read the printed name softly without repeating it twice. The dates lined up with last week in neat columns, and the purchase list looked like roadside dinners between midnight and 2. He asked Mara if the guest from yesterday had paid cash, and she nodded, then reached for the phone to check archived calls. The front desk handset kept scratchy tapes by default, a habit from the previous owner who never trusted software invoices. She played a call stamped at 2 in the morning, where a tired voice asked for room 12, mentioning a late delivery and stiff back. Another call at 2:30 asked about vending, and a third at 4 asked if nobody would bother him until noon. Lyle switched to evidence mode, careful and methodical, letting his coffee cool while he cataloged the pouch contents. He photographed the safe before moving anything, then called his supervisor to report an unexpected discovery unrelated to the truck claim. The supervisor told him to act reasonably and preserve anything with identifiable information, then to keep his focus on the scheduled inspection. He listened to the voice recorder after asking Mara to stay within earshot, since 2 listeners felt wiser than one on strange mornings. The first file held roadway noise, then a quiet tone of someone rehearsing directions, same room number repeated like a sticky thought. The second file was shorter, a man saying he could not keep doing this and that she would understand once it was delivered safely. He paused to note the words safely, which felt pointed given the open door and the blinking keypad. He bagged the recorder in a zip bag from his kit, then checked the keycard from the other town, which was stamped with a lion logo. Mara recognized the chain and said there was a property 30 miles north, mostly used by truckers and medical travelers. He returned the room to normal and headed for the burned truck with his camera bag, but his plan had started to wobble. The pickup sat behind a towing yard fence, soot clinging thick to the firewall, while melted wires drooped like tired ivy. He worked the usual grid of photos, then the odometer and the cargo bed, then cross-reference with dispatch notes he had requested by email. The fire report smelled like common engine loss, not sabotage, and he felt relief settle along his shoulders as the cause narrowed. He dictated measurements and closed the laptop, then looked at his watch and thought about the safe again and the trembling voice. He felt a nudge of duty that had nothing to do with premiums, and he drove back to the motel through heat that made the road shimmer. Mara met him with a printout of last night guests, which listed an alias that matched the loyalty card name partly. The address field showed a mail drop location, familiar to freight drivers who rolled through without a fixed base. She said a long white tractor had idled near the ice machine last night, according to a neighbor who called about fumes after midnight. He asked for the neighbor number, then listened to a careful woman describe a man in a reflective jacket with a limp. She said he stayed near room 12 door, not inside, as if waiting for someone to arrive quietly or leave quickly. She heard 2 quiet knocks around 3, and a soft voice answered, then a cart rattle like someone moving luggage without wheels. Lyle opened the pouch again and noticed a handwritten code on the receipt back, 4 digits and a messy star next to it. He tried the code on the safe, and the delay light flashed, which often meant an old user lockout or a wrong sequence. He snapped a photo and lowered the door, then rolled the notched tool between his fingers, a weight that felt borrowed from someone patient. He thought about a repairman he had interviewed in 2019 who taught him that thieves love patterns more than courage. The man said patterns live in receipts, tolls, and vending logs because tired people seek familiar sandwiches and coffee brands. Lyle searched the loyalty program website on his phone, typed the partial name and 4 digits, and got a generic profile with travel points. The profile showed recent redemptions listed by city, and he wrote them on a notepad, then drew lines between dates and approximate routes. The cities formed a loop around distribution centers, with brief pauses near hospitals and bulk pharmacy hubs according to public maps. He felt his heart step faster as the voice recorder line about delivered safely nudged his thoughts toward the quiet side of medicine. He told Mara he would drive north to the Lion Logo Motel for a quick visit, and she insisted on calling ahead politely. The clerk up there skimmed her stay sheets and mentioned a forgotten envelope last week, found under a mattress frame during turnover. The envelope held nothing when housekeeping retrieved it, but a corner showed marks from a rubber band, reportedly stretched tight. He reached the northern property by mid-afternoon, watched trucks rock gently in wind, and asked for the manager on duty. A tall man with tired eyes met him in the lobby, said a nurse had asked about a lost pouch 3 nights ago. She wore a badge from a staffing agency, spoke quickly, and left a number that went to voicemail full by morning. The manager allowed a quick look at the lost and found cabinet, which contained phone chargers, a chipped mug, 3 lanyards, and a plastic bag with an empty pharmacy sticker peeled halfway. Lyle photographed the bag and wrote the former label number carefully, then stepped into the parking lot to call a friend in compliance he trusted. The friend checked a public database of recalls and shortages, then told him to consider the rise in small clinical thefts along transport corridors. He returned to his car and replayed the second audio file, hearing the way the man swallowed hard between sentences. The phrase "delivered safely" stuck again, and he wondered if safely meant to someone specific, not to a warehouse or anonymous shelf. He drove back to the first motel with a plan forming, not quite a theory, but a set of steps that could either untangle or embarrass him. He asked Mara for permission to review last week camera footage that covered the breezeway near room 12, and she agreed. The feed was old, grainy, and stamped with the wrong date, since nobody reset it after storms in 2015. Still, silhouettes moved clearly enough, and at 3:12, a figure in a reflective jacket appeared with a short, careful stride. The figure waited near the door, then crouched to slide something under, then stood fast as another figure approached from the stairwell. The second person carried a rolling cart with a blanket thrown over, which hung low enough to hide a small cooler shape. They exchanged a short handshake, then rolled the cart toward the soda machine area, where cameras always blinked with static. Lyle paused the frame and sketched the handshake position, because small, consistent gestures tied people to habits when faces stayed hidden. He compared the notebook times to the archived calls, matching the neighbor report with the footage minute stamp nearly exactly. He folded his notes and looked at Mara, who watched quietly with the clipboard held like a shield against a sudden chill. He called the non-emergency line and asked to speak with property crimes, then explained he was an adjuster who found items in a room safe. He said the items might connect to an ongoing pattern, not a single incident, and that he was available to hand them over cleanly. The dispatcher thanked him and routed the call, and he kept his voice steady while explaining that nobody was hurt today. The detective who arrived wore a tie gone soft at the edges, a man who had seen this exact motel a dozen times. He took the pouch, the recorder, and copies of the photos, then asked Lyle to explain the breaker trick and the code attempts. He nodded at the handshake frame and said a group had moved product along back roads for months, staying under dollar thresholds on purpose. Lyle asked quietly if product meant medicine, and the detective said people cut solutions with water and resold to small clinics. In some stories, the clinics were victims with forged orders, and in others, they were partners, trying to stretch short supplies like taffy. The man in the reflector jacket likely ran deliveries for cash while hauling legal freight, which made tracing routes messy and confusing. The detective listened to the voice files twice, then looked at the loyalty redemptions and circled 2 cities with his pen. He said the phrase "delivered safely" could mean to a person at a care home who could not pay official prices anymore. The pouch might have served as a drop signal, and the room safe might have held a stopgap in case someone panicked. They took statements from Mara and the neighbor by phone, and the manager at the northern property sent a scanned copy of his notes. The detective collected the notch tool and said it was standard for bypassing cam locks, which matched a series of quiet thefts from vending. He asked Lyle to write a formal summary of his steps, meticulous and dated, and to expect a follow-up if a warrant landed later. Lyle finished the paper part in his room, breathing slow while light crept through the blinds in a warm, tired stripe. He wrote down the way the safe beeped twice after power restoration, which suggested a default that anyone patient could eventually find. He wrote the route loop and the hospital adjacency, and he wrote the voice phrasing exactly because transcription mattered when memories warped. He closed his laptop and stared at the open safe like it wanted to be ordinary again, silent and blank and light. He felt that shift people talk about when routine work bends into something it has no business touching on a weekday. He thought about honest clinics, rationing doses, then about someone paying cash at 3 in the morning because a parent cried. At dusk, the detective called back and said a unit found the white tractor idling near a different budget property downtown. The driver had the same chain lanyard from the lost and found cabinet, and his phone contained notes about room safes by brand. He reportedly told officers he was only a messenger and that someone else handled actual swapping and dilution, which sounded flat and practiced. Lyle listened quietly and said he would be available if a deposition request arrived. Then he sat with the keycard on the dresser. He knew he would remember the feel of that notched tool because it had a purpose-built patience that felt personal. He knew he would remember the cheap beep of the safe and the way a single small space changed the line of his day. A week later, he got an email from the detective, brief and measured, thanking him for the timeline and the careful photos. The message said the pouch had traces of saline and a label adhesive compound common to medical packaging of a certain class. The voice on the recorder matched a man pulled over near a way station, according to dispatch logs and an archived booking photo. Lyle drove back to the motel after closing another case, and he asked Mara how business felt since the long Tuesday. She said people still stopped for highway rest, and she tightened a few procedures quietly, preferring to let small changes speak. She now kept master codes in a locked drawer and replaced 3 aging safes with models that logged attempts for a full week. They stood in room 12 a moment, like visitors paying respects to an inanimate witness that never blinked. The safe sat closed and calm, doing exactly what a box was meant to do, which felt both reassuring and strange. He signed the receipt for his stay, then shook her hand, and promised to bring better stories next time through. On the drive home, he thought about the phrase delivered safely again and how words can hide more than they reveal. He wondered how many small transactions keep the world running, good and bad, unremarkable and decisive, stacked behind quiet doors. He decided the safe had not made him heroic or special, it had only reminded him that dull edges can cut when pressure builds. He kept working claims, taking pictures of bent bumpers and damp carpet, writing notes with careful times and plain language. He still believed that truth likes details and that details prefer patient notebooks, not flashy speeches or clever hunches. When he thought about that Tuesday, he did not think about danger or chase lights. He thought about how a box opened and a day veered left. Mara hired another housekeeper and bought a better cart, one that glided without rattling near cameras and soda machines. She laughed more at the front desk now, but her eyes still checked keys and codes before she turned off the lights. She told her nephew that small routines matter, like counting towels and returning clipboards, because order resists the creep of careless luck. The detective moved on to other cases and sent one last note months later, carefully worded, acknowledging ongoing court schedules. He wrote that the room safe discovery had clarified timing between suspects, which helped align witness statements with fuel receipts precisely. He added a line about public hearings scheduled for late next spring, where facts would hopefully land on paper clearly. The motel kept renting room 12 to travelers who wanted ground-level convenience and an easy walk to the ice. The safe held wallets and passports and nothing dramatic for a while, which suited everyone whose name stayed off any report. The highway kept pouring itself past the parking lot, and the night clerk kept coffee hot for anyone who needed comfort. Lyle sometimes thought about stopping by without a claim, just to buy a soda and wave at the office through dusty glass. He pictured the safe blinking quietly in that square of afternoon sun, as if practicing for whatever day came next. He accepted that the box had not changed him completely, but it had polished a habit he already valued deeply. He looked back on it like a narrow bridge he crossed safely, not a legend, just a real span over a quiet creek. He had listened, he had written, he had looked twice, and he had taken small steps that lined up neatly. That felt like enough for a life that preferred steady roads to loud headlines, and it still does. The stories. Why this librarian reopened a cold map drawer. In late September of 2014, the Quiet Town Library off Route 47 got a new head librarian named Corinne Ashland. She was 39, a former archivist who'd spent years cataloging geological surveys for a state university. By all accounts, Corinne wasn't the kind of person to chase ghosts until the day she decided to reopen an old, locked map drawer that everyone else had forgotten. The drawer sat in the basement stacks, labeled time state topography 1952 to 1958 asterisk. Its brass handle had gone dull with age, and the key was missing. For years, staff used the cabinet as a makeshift table for coffee mugs and boxes of donations. But one morning, while rearranging a shipment of donated atlases, Corinne noticed a faint rust-colored smear near the label. It looked like dried clay or maybe iron dust. Either way, it didn't belong there. She mentioned it to her assistant, and he laughed, saying, "That drawer's cursed. Ask Mrs. Langley. She swears a surveyor disappeared working on those maps." Corinne smiled politely, but something in her stayed hooked on the idea. She asked around. The drawer dated back to when the building served as a records annex for the county planning office. In the mid-50s, several regional floodplain studies were stored there before the files were relocated or supposedly relocated to the state archives. No one ever verified that. When Corinne checked the archive's digital inventory, she found gaps. 4 missing surveys, all from the same year, 1957. They covered a stretch of riverland that was later condemned for a hydroelectric project that never materialized. That evening, Corinne used a universal key set kept for restoration work and opened the map drawer for the first time in decades. Inside were rolled parchments bound with cotton strings, their edges yellowed. Beneath them, she found a tin box wrapped in wax paper. Inside the box lay a water-stained notebook, a compass with a cracked lens, and a faded photograph of 2 men standing beside a field the size of a football stadium, ringed by survey poles. On the back of the photo, someone had written, asterisk, last day before the dig, GM asterisk. Corinne scanned the initials against old employment rosters. There was a Gregory Mahlon, a field engineer who'd gone missing in June of 1958. Officially, he'd left the project for family reasons, but the local paper from that summer told a stranger story. Asterisk, surveyor vanishes near proposed reservoir site. Search suspended after 3 days. Asterisk, no follow-up, no body recovered. Corinne started a file. 1. She called the county records department. A man named Leland Cross, an aging clerk who'd worked there since the 70s, remembered something. Mahlon. Yeah? He was working on the Franklin Bend plan. Whole thing got shelved when the funding dried up. I heard his partner quit soon after. Leland didn't recall the partner's name, but he mentioned an old storage trailer the county once kept near the riverbank. They hauled the trailer out after a flood in the 60s, he said. If anything survived, it's in the historical depot now. The depot was just a few miles away. Corinne drove there that weekend, signed in as a researcher, and requested the Franklin Bend materials. The clerk brought her a warped cardboard box smelling of mildew. Inside were soil samples, invoices, and a reel of magnetic tape marked Audio Log 4 field notes. She had to borrow an old player from the depot staff. The recording was faint, but clear enough to recognize 2 male voices. Asterisk, Greg, you're not logging this, right? Asterisk. Asterisk. Relax. It's just us. But if this ridge keeps sinking, we need to report it. Asterisk. Relax. Relax. Asterisk. Asterisk. We will. After the last survey, the company can't afford another delay. Asterisk. The tape ended with wind noise and a scrape, like a microphone hitting dirt. Corinne replayed it 3 times, listening for landmarks. At one point, one of them mentioned mile marker 12 and the culvert by the sycamores. Using digitized topographic maps, she traced those features to a narrow bend along the river, now fenced off as private land. When she brought this to the local sheriff's office, the deputy shrugged. If you're talking about Mahlon, that case is older than my dad. We can't go digging around on private property for a rumor. But Corinne wasn't chasing rumor. She was following evidence. She emailed a geologist friend from her university days, Dr. Theo Ricks, who specialized in landslide patterns. Theo ran a ground-penetrating radar survey along that same bend under a research permit for soil erosion. The data showed a deep subsidence pocket about 20 feet from the current riverline, consistent with an old collapsed tunnel. Theo sent her the printout and a note, asterisk, you might have just found their camp trench. Asterisk. They returned together a week later. Theo handled the radar equipment while Corinne recorded the coordinates. Near sunset, a small piece of metal surfaced from the silt, a corroded survey tripod leg, stamped Property of Franklin Bend Hydro Limited. The find was modest, but it confirmed the crew had worked exactly where she predicted. From that point, Corinne began piecing the timeline. The notebook from the tin box mentioned sudden soil shifts, pressure readings, and the phrase asterisk, map variance, river shift, not natural. Asterisk. The handwriting was Mahlon's, matching samples from his earlier reports. It appeared he suspected someone had deliberately diverted a drainage channel to falsify flood risk data, possibly to inflate land value before government acquisition. If true, exposing it could have derailed the whole project. The company had millions at stake. Mahlon filed his last note 2 days before he vanished. Corinne cross-checked the company records and found the corporation dissolved in 1961, right after a quiet lawsuit settlement with an undisclosed party. No public record linked it to Mahlon. But tucked inside the notebook's back cover, hidden beneath the lining, she found a short letter addressed to M.R. Hanley, attorney at law. It never got mailed. The ink was blurred but readable enough. Asterisk, they moved the stakes. If anything happens, check the revised map in drawer C. It's the only truth left. Asterisk. Drawer C was the one she'd opened. By early winter, local journalists picked up her findings. The county authorized a limited excavation, mainly to verify the historic maps. When workers dug near the subsidence pocket, they uncovered remnants of an old metal barrel containing drafting tools and fragments of canvas. Among them was a wristwatch, glass shattered, still faintly engraved, asterisk GM, asterisk dental fragments. Nearby later confirmed Mahlon's identity. The discovery didn't just solve a missing person case, it revealed a quiet cover-up. The original floodplain data, preserved in those maps, showed the river was unstable long before developers planned the reservoir. Ignoring it had likely saved the investors short-term losses, but cost one man his life. The county issued a formal acknowledgement of error, though no one alive faced charges. The land was later rezoned as a conservation area. Corinne kept working at the library, though people now came from all over asking about the librarian who solved the map mystery. She never took credit beyond saying she just followed what was left behind. The old drawer was cleaned, cataloged, and displayed behind glass with the tin box and the compass inside. Every so often, she'd unlock the case to polish the brass handle, and she'd think about Mahlon's note, the way he wrote times the only truth left, asterisk. She understood now that archives aren't just about paper or ink, They're about the things people try to bury, and the few who still choose to look. By the next spring, the library basement smelled of fresh paint. The drawer sat quietly in its corner, again, cool metal against the hum of fluorescent lights. And that was enough. No headlines, no dramatics, just a reminder that sometimes reopening the past isn't about curiosity. It's about letting someone finally be found. The stories. The motel room safe with a secret ledger. The motel sat just off a two-lane highway that curved through a stretch of desert where radio stations faded to static. The sign still buzzed faintly, a few letters missing so that it read, asterisk, Elton Mo L asterisk. For years, the rooms had been rented mostly to truckers, traveling salesmen, and people who didn't want their names on a record. But in the spring of 2011, a part-time maintenance worker named asterisk asterisk Vince Daly asterisk asterisk, age 42, came across something in room 12 that would change how the place was remembered. Vince wasn't an ambitious man. He fixed air conditioners, mowed the patchy grass, and replaced broken keys. On that particular morning, he was there to remove a faulty safe from under the dresser. It had been locked for years, ever since the manager before last passed away. The new owner told him to cut it open so the space could finally be rented again. Inside was a single object, a small black ledger, its edges curled and faintly sticky, as if something had spilled on it long ago. The front cover had no name, no label, just a thumbprint stain. Vince assumed it was nothing. Maybe a guest had used it to keep receipts. He tossed it in his tool bag and went on with his work. Later that evening, curiosity got the better of him. He opened the ledger while sitting at the counter of a diner across the road. The first few pages were normal lists of initials, dates, dollar amounts, but halfway through, the tone shifted. Names were written in full, alongside words like balance cleared and returned. Some lines had stars next to them, and others were crossed out entirely. Near the back, he saw a series of entries dated between 1984 and 1987, all under a heading written in shaky block letters, asterisk asterisk collections room 12. Asterisk asterisk. At first, Vince thought it might have been a motel expense log, but a few of the names seemed familiar. One matched a woman whose picture still hung behind the front desk, a former housekeeper who disappeared decades ago. He mentioned it the next day to asterisk asterisk Marlene Greer asterisk asterisk, the daytime manager, who shrugged and said old records were full of ghost entries. Still, something in her expression told him she wasn't entirely surprised. Over the next few days, Vince couldn't let it go. He went to the county library and looked through microfilm archives of local newspapers. In late August of 1986, he found a short article about a missing motel employee named asterisk asterisk Carla Mendez asterisk asterisk. The story said she'd last been seen leaving work after a night shift, carrying the deposit bag for the week's earnings. Police assumed robbery, but no suspect was ever found. That name Carla was written 3 times in the ledger, each next to the same date. Asterisk asterisk August 22, 1986. Asterisk asterisk. One entry read, final balance, then ledger closed. The coincidence was too clean to ignore. Vince took photocopies of the pages and showed them to a retired sheriff's deputy he knew, asterisk asterisk Alton McRae, asterisk asterisk, who had worked the area back then. Alton took one look and went quiet. After a moment, he said the handwriting reminded him of asterisk asterisk Ray Weller, asterisk asterisk, the motel owner in the 80s. Weller had died in 1992 after his car went off a canyon road. No foul play suspected, just bad brakes and too much whiskey. Alton said there were rumors Weller used the motel as a front for short-term loans cash advances to locals who couldn't go through a bank. The ledger might have been his way of keeping track of who owed what. The crossed-out names, he explained, could mean debts paid, or something worse. Vince started noticing how people reacted when he mentioned the find. Some locals would change the subject. Others told him not to dig. The place had been losing business for years, and nobody wanted reporters sniffing around. But he couldn't shake the thought that someone might still care about what happened to Carla Mendez. He tracked down her sister, Isabel who still lived 2 towns over. When he showed her the ledger, she didn't even touch it. She just said, "We already tried for 25 years. Nobody cared then. They won't now." Before leaving, she pointed at one of the other names, P. Larkin. He was a regular there, she said. Used to drink with the owner. Ask the bartender from that time if he's still alive. Vince found Pete Larkin listed in a 2020 phone directory. He was living in a nursing facility about 30 miles away. When Vince called, the man's memory was fading, but one thing stuck. There was cash, Larkin said. Every weekend, people paid what they owed. Weller called it the 12 Club. Said if you didn't pay up, you checked out for good. It sounded like drunken talk, but when Vince returned to the ledger, he realized that almost all entries labeled cleared were tied to weekends. One page listed the amount 500 next to C. Mendez, and a note, handled in 12. At this point, the facts that remained were simple. Carla disappeared on August 22nd, 1986. Weller's ledger mentioned her by name that same day. Weller died 6 years later in what might have been an accident, and now, decades later, his motel still stood, barely operating, with a safe no one had opened until Vince cut it loose. He reported everything to the local sheriff's office. They took the ledger as evidence, but nothing came of it for months. Then, in early October of 2012, a construction crew working on a new drainage ditch behind the property uncovered partial human remains. Dental records confirmed they belonged to Carla Mendez. The investigation was reopened. Forensic teams matched residue from the ledger's pages to soil found at the burial site. Both contained the same rare industrial solvent used in the motel's janitorial supplies during the 80s. It wasn't enough to convict anyone, but it closed a circle. The 12 Club wasn't a rumor. It was bookkeeping for threats carried out. By the time the motel finally shut down, Vince had long quit. He moved north, took a job maintaining cabins at a lakeside resort, and stopped talking about what he'd found. Reporters wrote short pieces calling it the Ledger case, and then it faded again into local legend. Years later, when the building was demolished, one last item turned up in the rubble, a second, safe, smaller, newer, but sealed tight. Inside, they found only a key-tagged room 12. Copy. Nothing else, no pages, no ledgers, just that key. Placed deliberately. People who'd worked there guessed Vince had planted it, a quiet nod to what he'd uncovered, but those who knew him said he wouldn't have done that. He hated attention. Maybe it was Weller's doing, a strange joke meant to outlast him. Either way, the motel's sign was gone, the ground was leveled, and the highway kept humming like nothing had ever happened. Still, sometimes at night, when the wind passes through the empty lot, locals say you can hear the faint rattle of a loose metal door like an old safe settling back into silence. Whether that's true or not hardly matters. What stayed was the story, and the proof that even the most ordinary places can keep ledgers of their own. The stories. Ranger station logs noted a missing hiker at noon. The radio crackled just after lunch, and the clipboard showed a blank line beside a borrowed bear spray canister. The word missing sat in block letters on the duty sheet, and the clock over the map board ticked louder than usual. Renata Vale worked the desk that week, 38, seasonal ranger with a stubborn streak for clean paperwork. The station sat outside a popular canyon where the trail ran through scrub pine, and July heat made the air taste metallic. Her plan for the day was simple: clear the lost and found shelf and call two vendors about water filters. Plans changed when a volunteer handed her the trail phone and said a worried brother was holding. He said his sister failed to text from the halfway point, and he used the word routine like a spell. He gave a name that did not exactly match the sign-in sheet, and his voice thinned when Renata asked about clothing and pack color. He had a screenshot of their last conversation, time-stamped just before noon, and said a ranger blog recommended checking the canyon switchbacks first. Renata felt the quiet alarm that starts in a seasoned ranger's hands, the kind that steadies rather than shakes. She called the number on the permit sticker that matched the closest name, and a voicemail box chirped with a clipped greeting. She checked the station cameras that watched the parking turnouts and found a silver sedan rolling in at 10:20. The driver wore a brimmed hat and taped the ends of the laces, a detail Renata wrote down because details age poorly when pressure arrives. The volunteer named Marco searched the trailhead kiosk for the morning log, while Renata stepped into the sun and scanned the ridge. Wind pushed dry heat across the gravel, and a jay scolded from the utility pole. She keyed dispatch and said they had a potential overdue hiker, not confirmed, and that initial checks were underway. She kept the language tight because words build momentum, and momentum brings helicopters that the budget cannot always afford. A woman in gym shorts approached with a dog and said she had heard a shout near the lower falls, short and sharp like a name. The dog sniffed the air and leaned toward the creek, then lost interest and sat her down. Renata asked about time and direction, then thanked her and pressed the note card against the map with a magnet. Witness statements fail without anchors, so she pinned the details to the grid and reviewed them aloud. Marco returned with the binder of trail camera stills that interns pulled from a motion unit near the bridge. The images showed the brimmed hat at 11:16, then again at noon on the switchback above the falls. The shirt color looked different under the dappled light, a common effect on digital stills that gave Renata a moment of doubt. She printed two frames and circled the pack strap, then clipped them to a clipboard for the field check. Her simple plan melted fully when dispatch called back with archived calls. A person had phoned the tip line at 11:42 and asked about trail closures on the East Rim, then hung up when asked for a callback number. The caller used a masked service that had failed before, and the audio had that empty room sound that suggested a roadside kiosk or a cheap motel. Renata pressed a knuckle against the map and agreed to log the call as related. She put together a step-by-step, starting light and staying local to the canyon. First, a hasty sweep from the bridge to the switchbacks with one ranger and one volunteer. Second, a parking lot inventory to match plates to permits and to note any vehicles with cooling engines that did not match sign-ins. Third, a witness walk with the dog owner to the lower falls, with a promise to return her to the trailhead within the hour. She radioed the plan and heard the click of acknowledgement from Wyatt Perales, 32, trail tech and steady boots in rough ground. They moved out along the creek, and the summer smell shifted from dust to algae and sunscreen. A couple in sun hats pointed to a narrow ledge where someone had left a crushed water bottle and a candy wrapper. Renata photographed the area with a department phone, then bagged the trash because trash turns into stories when the wrong eyes find it. She kept her sentences short on the radio and noted her times with a pen that left grooves deeper than the ink. At the switchback, Wyatt found boot scuffs that angled off the tread and into scrub so tight it would punish any shortcut. He pointed to a pressed patch of grass, then to a low branch with a pale scrape that matched soft plastic. Renata crouched and saw a faint thread from athletic tape, the same color she remembered from the still. The thread clung to rough bark, a small but useful tether between the images and the ground. They moved higher and reached a shallow spur where the view opened into a dry basin. On the spur, a pair of hikers said they passed a woman alone who looked back often, as if waiting for someone who never arrived. The hikers spoke slowly and paused to remember, then agreed to write brief statements at the station later that afternoon. They offered a photo from a distance that showed only a shape in heat shimmer, and the horizon looked bleached and wide. Renata asked the brother for more context by text, keeping questions narrow and practical. What snacks did she favor? Any injuries last year? And did she ever speak about this specific canyon? He replied that his sister planned the hike to test a new route from a guide forum and sent a blurry screenshot of a message board thread. A username bragged about a hidden shelf that saved 20 minutes, and that sentence pressed a new line into Renata's plan. She called the district's archive and asked for old incident notes related to the shelf, and the clerk said there were two minor rescues on a heat weekend 3 summers ago. Those notes described short slips and stubborn walkers and contained a detail that felt right and wrong at the same time. Both incidents started at noon when shadows shortened and depth perception failed, and both involved hikers who disliked crowds and sought quiet. Another message arrived from the brother that changed tone from worried to careful. He said a coworker reportedly spotted a silver sedan at a grocery near the highway at 1:30 with the brimmed hat visible through the windshield. He said the coworker did not want to get involved, and that felt useful in a different way. Renata thanked him and wrote the time down, then circled highway with a question mark that drew a slow breath from Wyatt. They pushed through Manzanita to reach the rumored shelf and found it narrower than described, with a crumbling margin that looked unfriendly. A faint shoe print showed a split tread that matched a popular brand, and a smear on the rock smelled like cheap bug spray. Wyatt anchored a line to a juniper and leaned just far enough to see a small alcove with shade and a clean view of the bridge. A person could wait there unseen, then return to the trail when passing groups moved on. Renata called dispatch to log the shelf and asked for a quiet check on the grocery footage if the store manager would allow it without a formal request. She kept the ask light, and the clerk at the store reportedly agreed to review only the parking lot from 1:15 to 1:45. While they waited, they spoke to a fisherman who said he had heard someone practicing a greeting near the bridge, polite and warm, the way people rehearse before calling an office. They returned to the station to regroup and found the dog owner had kept her promise about the statements. She drew a crude map of her walk and marked the spot where the shout came, which lined up with the shelf by a neat stroke. Renata checked the plate list from the lot, and one entry bothered her because the registration sticker covered an older color. That usually meant a cheap repaint, often done quickly when a car changes hands among friends. The call from the store came back while the clock swept toward 4. Footage reportedly showed a silver sedan near the outer edge, and the driver wore a brimmed hat. The camera caught the driver opening the trunk, then closing it without removing anything. The driver sat for a full minute, then left the lot with a slow signal that suggested careful timing rather than confusion. That action made less sense if a hiker was lost, and more sense if a narrative needed space. Renata asked the brother to send any recent photos of his sister's gear so they could match brands and colors to the thread on the branch. He sent a camping picture from spring, and the pack straps matched the stills with unnerving accuracy. He also sent a photo of a laminated media badge from a fitness channel and apologized for forgetting to mention that side gig. Renata stared at the badge and felt the click of pieces rubbing into place. She pulled the permit files again and found a second entry from the morning that used a near match to the name, with a transposed letter that looked accidental at first glance. The second entry had a note in different handwriting that said, "Early shoot near bridge, approved by office." The office had approved no such shoot as far as Renata knew, and a deep memory of an email warning about unauthorized product videos rose to the surface. Those videos sometimes used stage trouble to capture attention, then rode the wave for clicks and ad buys. She contacted the regional office and asked whether a crew had requested permission that day, and the answer came back tidy and negative. The office asked for details, and Renata kept her language cool and focused on logs and times. She included the masked call and the quiet shelf, and the fact that a brimmed hat appeared where a plan would benefit from a dramatic turn. She asked for guidance on whether to treat the case as a welfare check or as a permit violation with a side of false alarm. Before the office replied, Wyatt flagged a new detail from the camera stills that had felt unimportant earlier. The brimmed hat in the second still carried a small pin that caught the sun, and the same pin appeared on the media badge in the spring photo. It was a tiny compass rose with 3 points bent, a logo for a training program that marketed grit and quiet strength. The pin created a line between online identity and trail identity, often a line people try to blur when views are currency. The volunteer team returned from the upper spur with a clean report and no sign of distress along the ridge. A group of teenagers said they watched a drone rise above the bridge and glide toward the shelf, then return quickly when someone shouted about rules. The teenagers filmed the drone on a phone, and the video captured the brimmed hat figure leaning on the railing, then turning away when the shout landed. Renata saved the clip and documented the time, then asked the group to leave contact details in case the office needed follow-up. As evening light softened, dispatch called with a quiet advisory. A patrol unit had found a silver sedan parked at a scenic turnout 15 miles east, empty and cooling, with a folded jacket in the back. The officer waited nearby without lights and reported a second vehicle pulling in close, then leaving when the cruiser rolled forward. The plate on the second car belonged to a rental agency with a flexible policy about credit cards, a detail Renata captured without judgment. The office finally replied and advised a welfare check with a parallel inquiry into misuse of emergency channels. They recommended a measured approach that prioritized safety and avoided public drama. Renata agreed and then called the brother again and asked him to come to the station, explaining that in-person rooms make details easier to manage. He arrived with shoulders high and hands careful, and he looked like someone who disliked being on the wrong side of a counter. He admitted the channel sometimes staged challenges and that his sister had pitched a solo speed test that needed daylight and a sense of risk. He insisted that no real danger was planned, only a late check-in, followed by a triumphant return and a lesson about preparation. He said a friend reportedly stood by with water near the highway, and the masked call was about closures because crowds ruin dramatic timing. He said he panicked when she missed the planned text by a full hour and called the station because the bit felt wrong. Renata listened and typed, then asked to speak with the sister by phone. The brother made a call on speaker, and the brimmed hat answered with a small breath. Then a quick apology that sounded practiced. She said she was safe and nearby, and that she feared trouble once she realized how many people had watched the bridge. She agreed to meet at the station within 30 minutes and added that the shelf was a mistake because the rock felt greasy and mean. She arrived with salt on her face and a steady gaze, 34, freelance trainer and editor for a mid-sized channel. She wore the pin on the brim and kept her hands open on the counter, then gave a full account that matched much of the timeline. She described the shelf and the alcove and admitted the staged silence to build tension for a cut. She said the drone operator backed out when a shout scared him and that the grocery stop was a pause to decide whether to end the bit early. Renata walked her through the consequences with a calm voice and clear steps. They would log the misuse of the term missing in the station ledger and forward a report on the masked call to the office. They would recommend a fine for the drone flight near the bridge and review the permit files for the transposed name entry. They would also offer a voluntary donation to the volunteer team for the hours spent and recommend a public safety note if the channel posted any edited footage. The woman nodded and said she understood, then asked whether the station planned to call the county. Renata said the county dispatch already sat in the loop and had agreed to remain cooperative as long as the channel avoided inflaming viewers. She added that the station took missing reports seriously because moments consume resources, and that even staged quiet pressures real systems. The woman agreed to record a clear statement and accepted a brochure on safe filming that looked oddly gentle in the harsh light. Wyatt stepped outside and watched the last cars roll out of the lot, and the air finally cooled enough to feel kind. The dog from earlier barked once from a passing truck, and the fisherman from the creek lifted 2 fingers without slowing. Renata filed the forms and wrote a final note that tied the shelf to the old rescues and the pin to the badge and the masked call to timing. The station lights hummed and the clock hands slid past 6, then found their mark without ceremony. By the time the brother and sister left, the word missing on the duty sheet had a line through it. Renata kept the original note card with the magnet hole because records tell stories when memory wants to embellish. The office would likely call tomorrow and ask for clarifications, and the drone policy would probably gain a new sentence. She felt the usual mix of relief and irritation that follows a false alarm, and the strange sympathy for people who turn risk into currency. Later, the channel posted a short video that downplayed the panic, and the comments argued about rules and grit. The station received 2 thank you emails from hikers who heard the news secondhand and a complaint from a person who disliked the fines on principle. Renata archived the messages and watered the plant on the windowsill, then wrote one more line in the log about the shelf that was not a shortcut. The sentence ended with a plain warning that noon creates flat shadows and false confidence, a small truth inside a larger one. In quiet moments after a shift like that, she believed most people want a story that forgives them. Trails do not forgive, they teach. And the classroom never closes just because cameras blink. The station would open again at 7, and the clipboard would carry new names, and the clock would tick in the same steady way. Somewhere on the ridge, a jay would scold the wind, and the shelf would wait with its narrow promise, ready to turn bravado into paperwork. The woman who disappeared near Carver's Gap. Travelers who stopped at the high pullouts near Carver's Gap reported a woman who waved once, then walked into thin spruce. The trail ran along the bald where wind hit with steady force from the Tennessee side. Lights stayed flat and cold despite late afternoon, and the ridgeline carried radio traffic from both counties. No one noted a plate because the parking area mixed hikers and locals without clear lines. The first call reached dispatch just before sunset, according to logs released later. Her name in the county file from 2009 matched a teacher who had moved between Carter and Avery over several years. She was 38 and worked part-time as a substitute while picking up seasonal museum hours in Johnson City. Friends said she came for the rhododendron bloom and stayed for the quiet above the state line. She reportedly carried a cheap handheld map and a stainless bottle marked with blue tape. Investigators never confirmed whether she owned a reliable compass, despite several receipts found in storage. The last certain sighting placed her near the wooden post where the Appalachian Trail heads north across the grass. A retired lineman named Carl said she asked about a side path that cut toward Round Bald before the weather turned. He described a calm voice and a careful walker who checked the sky twice and tightened her jacket sleeves. His watch read 4:30 by his account, and his memory stayed fixed on the sound of traffic below. Some locals claimed Carl changed the time later, which state records do not fully address. Dispatch logs mark a second report from a couple who parked beside a dented sedan with faded county stickers. They watched a woman stand near the information board and fold a copy of a trail brochure into a narrow strip. The man recalled her glancing at a silver pickup with an aftermarket light bar, then stepping away without hesitation. The woman recalled a slight limp that appeared only on the downhill portion near the first switchback. Records conflict on whether those statements were taken the same night or days later. Rain moved across Roan High Knob after dark, and patrols split between the paved lot and the forest roads. A ranger from the North Carolina side coordinated with a deputy from the Tennessee side using a shared radio channel. Volunteer searchers gathered near Carver's Gap just after midnight and walked grid lines under steady drizzle and shallow fog. They found boot marks that matched her size near a side trail where moss hid pooled water. Investigators never confirmed those impressions because runoff smeared edges before a cast could cure. Archived notes mention a lightweight day pack found under low branches around a quarter-mile from the main path. Inside were snack wrappers and a folded paper with a grocery list and a museum shift date. A phone sat in the outer pocket with a drained battery and a hair elastic wrapped twice around it. The screen held shallow scratches but no cracks, and the case showed a faded tourist sticker. Technicians pulled the card and recovered brief texts that ended earlier than the last reported sighting. Avery County reports list two unconfirmed leads involving a silver pickup seen idling near the pullout before rain. One hiker said the truck crept past the lot twice, which he found strange given poor visibility and slick pavement. Another hiker said the driver leaned forward and checked the mirror often while the engine surged at irregular intervals. Investigators never confirmed whether the pickup belonged to a local contractor who worked on fences near the highway. Records conflict on the license digits and the description of a sticker behind the rear glass. State records show a previous call involving the same teacher on Roan Mountain during early spring of 2019. She reportedly got turned around in sudden fog near Grassy Ridge and waited beside a cairn until voices approached. The party who found her said she stayed calm and kept talking about frost hollows and bird calls to stay oriented. An incident note described firm boots and a careful pace with brakes at regular intervals despite dropping temperature. Investigators never confirmed whether that episode affected her later planning or gear choices before June. In the week after the disappearance, family and colleagues organized small teams and checked shelters to the north. A museum co-worker carried printouts and asked pieced questions at hostels and gas stations between Elizabethton and Banner Elk. Several people remembered her spending coins on coffee and a pastry at a market near Roan Mountain State Park. Others insisted they saw someone else with similar hair and a similar jacket, which complicated the running timeline. The county file from 2009 contains those notes without a firm ruling on identity. A storm knocked power lines across the ridge and slowed organized searching while crews worked along the highway's shoulders. Helicopter support reportedly stood by until wind readings dropped into a safer band above the open balds. Heat signatures came and went as fog shifted across gullies and pooled in low draws between thick spruce. Teams marked possible tracks that crossed and recrossed animal prints near a wet seep where runoff gathered. Investigators never confirmed a single continuous line that matched her boots from the parking area. Weeks later, a trail runner found a stainless bottle wedged under a root beside a shallow step. Blue tape clung to the metal, and a fingerprint technician lifted partials that matched previous samples from her apartment. The cap showed light grit and a torn gasket, which might explain a sweet smell noted by two searchers. Some locals claim the bottle had not been there during early sweeps, which raised questions about movement after rain. Records conflict on when the site was first photographed and tagged for follow-up. The apartment in Johnson City held careful stacks of notebooks and a shoebox filled with admission stickers. One notebook mentioned a plan to walk the balds alone to map views for a lesson about settlement routes. Another page listed bus times and an alternate ride from a coworker whose statement later changed on 2 points. The coworker first said she offered a ride to the Gap, then said she offered a pickup from the Gap. Investigators never confirmed either offer, which left timing gaps across the late afternoon window. Bank records show a small withdrawal that morning and no further activity after the day of the hike. A library card saw used 2 days earlier for field guides that matched the notes found near the day pack. A phone account tied to a prepaid plan rolled over minutes on schedule without manual action from family. Technicians found no logins after the last tower handshake near the state line on the ridge. Dispatch logs carry that timestamp and mark it as the final verified ping. A rumor formed around an old farm road that drops toward a creek where anglers leave crushed cans. A property owner told deputies about a woman who waved once near a locked gate before stepping into Laurel. He could not fix the date and changed the season at least twice during follow-up interviews. His dog growled at the brush that evening, and he found cords of stacked wood disturbed along the fence. Investigators never confirmed the account, and state records caution that memory shifted after news coverage. Later that summer, a faded sedan matching the parking lot vehicle was towed from a private lot near Elk Park. A shop owner said the driver left it overnight and never returned to settle a quoted repair. The owner thought the driver was male based on height and a cap pulled low across the brow. The tag returned to a different county, and paperwork took time because of mismatched mailing records. Archive notes say the lead produced no direct link to the missing teacher despite initial excitement. By fall, snow brushed the high grass, and searchers changed tactics to check drainages for winter evidence. Teams followed game trails where leaves bridged small streams and gusts erased prints within minutes. A jacket scrap turned up near a low snag, but color comparisons did not match clothing in photographs. A volunteer insisted the fabric felt similar to a liner she wore during spring trips on the same ridge. Investigators never confirmed the match, and records conflict on whether the sample was cataloged correctly. The museum held a small gathering where colleagues read notes about her lectures on birds and trade routes across the mountains. A student recalled her steady pace during a field trip and a habit of counting steps between viewpoints. Another student remembered a hesitant smile that appeared when someone mentioned weather reports and trail etiquette near fragile plants. Some locals claimed she had hinted at moving away, which her sister denied in interviews with a regional reporter. The county file from 2009 keeps both statements without comment on reliability. Winter closed the high road at intervals, and ice grew along shaded cuts where plows could not hold traction. Crews marked fallen limbs and flagged slip corners, while visitors stayed lower in the valley towns. The case slipped from headlines but stayed in quarterly summaries prepared for both county commissions. Detectives traded notes about similar disappearances along the border where ridges tangle and lines divide jurisdiction. Investigators never confirmed meaningful overlap beyond weather patterns and occasional vehicle descriptions. In spring, a new ranger reviewed the folder and walked the first 3 miles north at dawn. He carried the printed dispatch logs and paused where the bale wire fence dips near a wet meadow. He noted how sound traveled along the bald and how voices blended with trucks grinding up the grade. A sudden shift in cloud shadow hid the post where the trail turns, and the path narrowed near wind-stunted trees. His memo suggested a simple misturn compounded by weather and fatigue without clear evidence of intent. Years have not settled the case, and no court file closes the matter with certainty. Reportedly, a hiker sometimes meets a man who still repeats the time and the steps and the exact wind. He stands by the wooden post and points where the grass folds over and the path looks wider than it is. Some locals claim she walked out on a different day and left by a service road near the towers. Investigators never confirmed that ending, and records conflict enough to keep the question alive near Carver's Gap. The stories. Why locals avoided that church basement after the flood. The church sat on a low rise beyond the river curve, and everyone still called it a safe hill. Neighbors said the floodwater reached the stained steps anyway, and the basement stayed damp long after the river fell. Clara Vass, 34, worked as a field insurance adjuster who took pictures, typed notes, and kept calm voices moving. She drove into the town after the levee break, aiming to document damage and close claims before tempers soured. Her goal for that day was simple: confirm a cluster of small claims tied to the hilltop church. The first change to her plan arrived when the custodian waved from the door, then refused the handshake. He gave his name as Ortis Malo, 57, a retired welder who mowed the lawn and watched the boiler. He said the sanctuary was fine, then pointed at the basement with a look people wear when a dog growls under a porch. Clara asked for access, and he said the pastor wanted meetings upstairs only. She took exterior photos, careful with angles, noting water lines marked by silt and by seeds caught on mortar. A neighbor named Nella Groft, 61, carried a crate of hymnals toward a sedan and paused to watch her. Nella said the basement had stayed locked since the flood week and that no one wanted to carry anything down there. Clara liked facts more than rumors, so she asked for invoices, damage logs, and utility records. Ortis handed over a folder with photocopied bills, each page smelling like bleach even through the plastic sleeve. The electric bill showed a high spike the week after the river fell, which struck her as odd for an empty space. When she asked for the basement key, Ortis rubbed his jaw and said the lock stuck, then said the pastor handled everything personally. She kept her voice soft, mentioned schedule pressure, then offered to meet the pastor after dinner and finish this site today. He agreed, but he kept glancing at the stairwell door like it might open on its own. Clara went to the county office and checked archived calls for emergency service using an index the clerk let her see without fuss. The church address appeared twice during the flood days, once for a fuel smell, once for a welfare check that cleared in minutes. A dispatcher note said volunteers had stacked food in the basement for short-term storage. She returned before sunset, met the pastor near the front pews, and introduced herself with her license card. Pastor Enoch Varela, 46, wore a work shirt with rolled sleeves, and his palms looked scraped at the knuckles. He repeated that the sanctuary took no damage, then said the basement had a minor issue they were addressing privately. Clara explained her process, said transparency helped claims move faster, and asked for a basic walkthrough with photos. He agreed to a limited tour, then warned her that the air down there felt close and would not be pleasant. She took out a disposable respirator she kept for mold sites, and he nodded with relief, like that solved part of it. The key turned after a stubborn rattle, and the door opened with a smell like wet paper mixed with diesel. Steps went down into dimness that felt cooler than upstairs, and the walls showed a faint brown tide mark. Her light found a row of folding tables stacked with canned goods and boxes, all tied off with twine. Several tabletops were warped, and the legs stood at different heights because someone had shimmed them with hymnals wrapped in plastic. A generator sat to one side with a coiled cord, and the floor around it showed a clean square like a rug had been there. She photographed outlets, tagged the generator model, and asked why they needed so much power for a basement pantry. The pastor said the generator ran sump pumps for 2 nights, then stopped working from grit in the line. Ortis stood near the bottom step and rubbed the rail, his knuckles pale, like he hated the room and also belonged to it. Clara noticed a water line over the breaker box, which meant the panel had taken a hit and still looked strangely spotless. A woman appeared in the doorway, waved, and introduced herself as Paloma Cray, 32, a volunteer nurse with the food team. Paloma asked if Clara needed masking tape for labels, then added that people had slept here during the flood watch. The pastor cut in with a quick no, and Paloma closed her mouth and drifted back into shadow. Clara felt the hush that follows a correction and decided to run her questions in a sequence that built without heat. She asked about occupancy during the flood, and Pastor Varela said only supplies had been staged downstairs. She asked to see any damage to pew cushions or classrooms, and he steered her back toward the stairs with a brisk thank you. In the parking lot, a teenager skated past and kicked the curb, then said people said the basement hummed after midnight. He pointed at the brickwork view vents near the ground and said sound came out like a freezer that could talk. He grinned, then looked sorry for talking, and pushed off toward the next slot without another word. Clara sat in her car and recorded a memo into her phone, keeping the tone neutral and the timestamp obvious. She reviewed photos, zoomed on the clean square by the generator, and marked a note about missing equipment. That square looked like freezer footprint, and on a raised plan like this basement, a freezer could stay mostly dry. Her next stop was a building supply yard, where she asked the clerk for recent sales of heavy appliances paid in cash. The clerk shrugged, then said a man from the church bought a chest freezer late in the flood week and paid without a receipt. That detail qualified as a witness statement, and she typed it as such, careful not to lean on it more than it deserved. Evening pushed in, and she returned for one more look while people set up for a community meal upstairs. She asked Paloma for 5 minutes in the basement to recheck the panel labels, promising to stay out of the way. Paloma agreed, then quietly handed over a small key that looked too new for an old door, her eyes level and steady. Downstairs, the lights flickered as if a loose connection lived somewhere behind the fresh panel cover. Near the far wall, she found two pallets draped with tarps that had been taped several times, and the tape pulled white in places. A faint, sweet odor rode the damp smell, like fruit left in a trunk after a warm day at the lake. She lifted a corner and found case water stacked over a long trough cut into the slab, its edges chipped and sharp. A length of garden hose ran from the trough to a sill drain where floodwater had once receded, and the hose still glistened. She followed the hose with her light, stepped around the tarps, and saw the end shoved behind a dented freezer. The cord was gone, but a film of oil on the floor traced a path toward the clean square near the generator. She crouched, counted to 5 to settle her breath, then stood and walked back toward the stairs to reset her approach. On the way up, she passed Ortis as he came down, his arms full of clean towels for reasons that felt unclear. Clara asked if they had documented any salvage from the basement that could justify the electric spike. He nodded too quickly, said there had been a spill from a donated machine, and that they had cleaned it thoroughly after. She thanked him, then stepped outside and listened to a rain gutter tick as the day cooled into night. Her hotel room was quiet, and she laid the photos on the table beside the binder she kept for flood jobs. She cross-checked the electric spike days against the generator ownership dates, using calls the county clerk let her copy. A pattern formed, modest and plain, which said power ran in the basement several nights after the river pulled back. She called a friend who worked restoration and asked about standard practice for wet freezers in basements. He said most techs would drag them outside, prop the lid, and tape a sign to keep people away until haul out. He said running a generator indoors for a freezer was dangerous, and added that diesel odor with sweet tang usually meant refrigerant leaked. Clara returned at first light and found Paloma sorting donated jackets on the front steps. Paloma watched the street, then said she had worked disaster shelters before and knew that water brings out the best and worst. She said she had asked to close the basement and that she would be happier if an outsider made decisions for them. With Paloma present, Clara requested a formal walkthrough with full photo documentation, and the pastor agreed after a long pause. He suggested they invite a town officer to keep things calm, and she agreed without hesitation since an extra witness helps. Officer Renwall, 39, arrived and signed the site log that Clara carried in her bag for exactly this moment. They opened the basement door together, and the smell rose again, edged with sourness that set teeth on edge. Wren kept a straightforward tone, said they would check for safety risks and nothing more, and the pastor nodded with his jaw set. They moved toward the far pallets, and Paloma touched Clara's elbow, then pointed with 2 fingers at the sill drain. Clara photographed the hose, the trough, and the freezer compression dents that matched a recent move across gritty floor. Wren looked at the panel and said the cover was new, then asked if an electrician had cleared it, keeping his voice even. Ortis said he would get the paperwork tomorrow, and stared at the drain like he feared what might back up through it. The twist waited in a storage closet behind a rolling chalkboard where someone had stacked plastic tubs in a neat column. Wren asked permission, lifted the lid on the top tub, and found medical waste bags tied with careful knots. The labels showed a clinic in a nearby county, and date codes matched the flood week plus 3 days after. Paloma exhaled, then said the town clinic had shut power during the worst night and that someone offered temporary cold storage here. The pastor stared at the bags and rubbed his temple, then said yes, they had tried to help and keep things under control. Ortis said the freezer had failed, they had panicked, and they had moved what they could to ice chests upstairs. Clara kept her voice in the middle as she asked whether any records accompanied the delivery of those bags. The pastor produced a photocopy from his wallet that showed a shaky agreement to secure and return the materials promptly. Wren read it twice, nodded, and said they needed to report this and arrange a proper collection, and the pastor said he understood. The pieces now fit the noise locals heard at night, the generator, and the spike in the bill after the rain. Refrigeration had kept those bags stable for a short window, then failed when the sump pumps stole too much current. The sweet tang in the air had been refrigerant, and the last trace of spoiled ice from makeshift coolers. They documented the closet, sealed the tubs again, and carried them upstairs where the air felt simple and bright. Wren radioed the county, asked for a hazmat team and the clinic contact, and kept his words plain so no one panicked. Paloma called volunteers to move the meal upstairs, and they did it quietly, like they were shifting a sleeping child. Within an hour, a small truck arrived with two techs who spoke carefully and signed every line Clara handed over. They packed the tubs into rigid containers and handed the pastor a receipt that settled chain of custody without drama. The tech said this sort of mix-up happens in storms when freezers are scarce, and that it becomes a cautionary tale for years. After the truck left, Clara took final photos of the basement and noted the cracked trough that had worried her from the start. She recommended a full inspection for the panel and air testing before volunteers returned to work downstairs. The pastor agreed, his voice steady now, and Ortis finally sat on the steps and let his shoulders drop like a load had slid off. The town never made a scandal of it, since nothing criminal had been intended, and the fix was clean and quick. That said, people still avoided the basement for a while, since memory can stick to concrete and walls like damp. They spoke of the humming nights as a warning, and they stored donations upstairs where anyone could see them in daylight. Clara filed the report that afternoon and drove out past fields that glittered with wet leaves pushed against fences. She felt no thrill, only quiet relief that the pieces had held together and that nothing worse had formed in secret. Her notes added a simple line that generosity without planning can rot faster than anyone expects in warm water. Later, she learned the church held a small meeting and told their members the whole sequence with plain language. They apologized to the clinic and offered money for the generator fuel that had been wasted in the failed plan. People appreciated honesty, but the basement kept its reputation because reputations have long legs when the air has smelled wrong. By autumn, the concrete was scrubbed, fans had run for weeks, and the panel wore a new sticker from an electrician. Still, a few congregants preferred folding tables upstairs, and no one minded because sunlight makes simple promises. When it rained again, the pastor stacked extra caution tape by the stairwell and kept the door locked without debate. Neighbors now say they avoided that basement not because of ghosts or whispers, but because they knew the facts. They remembered that freezers hum for reasons, and that a locked room with a sweet tang is a message rather than a mystery. The town chose to listen, and the story settled where most real stories live, halfway between relief and regret. Clara closed the file and moved on to other roofs and other high water marks, keeping her methods the same. She asked ordinary questions in steady sequence and waded through pauses that often carried more truth than quick words. The church needed time, the town needed air, and the basement needed light, and they all eventually got what they required. Years later, the flood was referenced as a hard season, not a nightmare, and the hill stayed a safe hill again. People mentioned the humming when they taught young volunteers how to store donations and why clear logs matter most. The pastor still kept the key, but he also kept the receipt that proved the chain unbroken, which made him sleep better. Clara would sometimes pass through on other assignments and find Paloma sorting jackets on the steps with calm hands. They would wave as if nothing remarkable had happened, which felt correct because the point was that nothing worse had arrived. The basement door stayed closed unless the work demanded it, and that quiet was the final lesson worth holding. The stories. This night guard filed a missing hours report. The file started as something routine, a timestamp discrepancy in a small town security log. A night guard at a regional warehouse filed a missing hours report claiming his time card didn't match the hours he'd actually worked. The report was short, oddly calm, and dated early March of 2019. No one thought much of it until he never came back to work. His name was Leon Hartridge, 43, a former truck driver who'd switched to night security after a back injury. The warehouse sat off a rural interstate, the kind of place that smells like cold concrete and diesel even after midnight. Leon's shift started at 10 and ended at 6. His wife told investigators he usually came home by 6:30, drank coffee, watched old westerns, then slept until afternoon. That pattern broke on a Wednesday night when he didn't clock out. The initial assumption was simple. Maybe he quit. Maybe he got another job, or maybe he just walked away. But the following morning, his supervisor found his lunchbox, still sealed, and a half-empty thermos on the break room counter. His reflective vest hung neatly on a hook, radio still attached. The last digital swipe of his ID was logged at 3:42 a.m., then nothing. The company filed a basic absence form, but by Friday, the sheriff's office got involved. They reviewed the overnight CCTV, 6 cameras in total. 5 worked fine. The sixth, covering the north loading dock, froze at exactly 3:41 a.m. Then, 3 minutes later, all motion detection stopped. It wasn't just a blackout. The file header showed it had been manually overwritten. Leon's brother, a retired electrician, offered to check his apartment when calls went unanswered. Inside, he found Leon's keys on the counter, wallet in the same place he always left it, and a spiral notebook on the kitchen table. The last entry, written in his blocky handwriting, read, "Clock shows 4 when I walk out. Feels later. Light's wrong color again." Investigators traced that note back to similar remarks he'd made to coworkers in the weeks before. One of them, a forklift operator named Ray Corbin, told deputies Leon had been bothered by something about the new lighting system. The company had replaced the overhead fluorescents with motion-activated LEDs that flickered under certain camera angles. He said it messed with his sense of time, Ray recalled. He'd come in thinking it was midnight and swear it was almost morning. At first, police treated the notebook as irrelevant, a tired man rambling about lights. Then came the dispatch logs. A 3:48 a.m. call had been placed from Leon's company-issued phone to a non-emergency county line. The recording still exists. He told the operator he needed to document something about the schedule. His tone was formal, detached, like he was making a statement rather than asking for help. The operator tried to clarify what he meant, but the line dropped mid-sentence. The call lasted 53 seconds. When they checked the network records, they found something else. The call didn't route through the cell tower nearest the warehouse. It bounced from a tower 30 miles east across the river. That's the same direction Leon's phone was last pinged before it went offline, near an unfinished section of the old state bypass, closed since 2011. Deputies drove out there and found fresh tire tracks in the gravel, leading toward a fenced construction lot. No vehicle was recovered. Weeks passed. Local news ran a single story: warehouse guard missing after time card dispute. Public interest faded quickly. And as fashion, local news wanted the power. But in June, the company's new HR contractor discovered something odd while auditing payroll. Leon's time card for that final night didn't just show missing hours, it showed duplicated entries. Between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., his ID was logged twice at 2 different doors, seconds apart. One swipe at the front entrance, one in the mechanical hallway. Same ID, same timestamp. Technically impossible. Investigators re-examined the internal server that housed the door logs. That's when they noticed a secondary access profile had been created using Leon's credentials, but tagged with a different department code, one belonging to the electrical maintenance division. The account was active for 1 week, then deleted. IT records listed the administrator as temporary systems testing. No one at the warehouse remembered authorizing it. The more they dug, the stranger the timeline became. Archived footage from prior nights showed brief blips in the digital clock, displays 3-second shifts where the time rolled backward before correcting itself. Leon had written about this in another note. Clock skipped again. Same moment the hum cut out. Technicians later confirmed that during those same minutes, a backup generator was cycling power for a series of sublevel fans. Only a few workers even knew the sublevels existed. They weren't active parts of the facility anymore. When authorities finally inspected the lower level, they found old offices sealed off with plastic sheeting and warning signs for asbestos. In one corner sat an unplugged time clock terminal dated 1994. The paper spool inside it still contained partial punch cards, yellowed and brittle. One of them bore Leon's employee number, printed faintly beside the name of a former contractor who died years earlier. That discovery reframed everything. Somehow, the modern ID system had merged data with the obsolete one, producing overlapping records that made it appear Leon was in two places at once. The missing hours report he'd filed wasn't about unpaid wages, it was about time itself, slipping in a way he couldn't explain. The investigators never found conclusive proof of tampering, though one retired systems tech told local reporters that the company's old mainframe still ran partial code from a discontinued scheduling program called ShiftLine. He claimed that under rare conditions, like a power cycle during data backup, it could duplicate entries with original punch data from the archive, labeling them with active credentials. If that happened when Leon's ID was scanned, it might have triggered a fatal error, but that's still theory. What's factual is this. The same Friday, the audit uncovered the duplicate entries. A highway cleanup crew reported finding a fragment of a reflective safety vest along the bypass construction route. It matched the brand issued to Leon's team. DNA analysis was inconclusive exposure, and time had degraded it. But one detail stood out. The vest's zipper pull contained traces of oil consistent with the warehouse's loading dock equipment. In the end, the case file closed under missing person, presumed deceased. Officially, no foul play. Unofficially, everyone agreed something in that building broke his sense of time before he vanished. His wife still keeps the notebook on a shelf. The last page, just beneath his final note, has a short line written in different ink, maybe added later, maybe the same night. It reads, "Clock shows 4, door says 3. At this point, the facts that remained were simple. A man noticed an inconsistency, tried to document it, and disappeared between two readings of the same minute. Whether that was error, accident, or something stranger about how those systems looped, no one can say for certain. The warehouse eventually upgraded its entire security network, scrapping every trace of the old servers. But the missing hours report still sits in the county archive, a single-page statement with the timestamp frozen at 3:42 a.m., the same moment the camera went dark. The Bridge Creek drowning that wasn't recorded. Locals in Deschutes County still mention a cold evening on Bridge Creek when a man vanished without an official entry. Witnesses later argued over the hour and the light while the water ran clear and slow beneath alder shade. The only certainty, according to archived notes kept in Bend, was that the call for help never landed where it should. The gap in paperwork turned an ordinary search into a puzzle that keeps reappearing in winter conversations. The man most often named was Trent Avery, 42, contract carpenter in the area to price repairs on a seasonal cabin. He reportedly arrived 2 days earlier and slept in his truck near Sisters to save money, according to a motel clerk. The cabin owner said he never signed in or asked for a key because daylight was already fading near the ridge. The owner told deputies he expected a text that never came, which is a detail that repeats across later statements. Avery met one person that afternoon, a fisheries tech named Mara Collins, 34, state employee, checking culvert screens along a Forest Service spur. She said the creek looked safe for a crossing at the ford, which remained shallow where gravel spread across two tire lanes. Her state records log for that date lists water clarity as good and current speed as moderate with no debris above the culvert. She remembered a white cooler in his truck bed and a neatly folded jacket on the passenger seat. Dispatch logs from that week show wildfire smoke along the highway and intermittent tower issues between Sisters and Camp Sherman. A technician wrote that calls sometimes hopped east before returning, which could explain later confusion over which county heard the first report. A private tower contractor filed a brief noting brief resets during the evening hour when shadows lengthened across the creek. The record is not a smoking gun, but it sits near the time window witnesses describe. Collins said she left him near 5 while the light still held, and the Ford looked routine for any cautious driver. She told investigators he waved and asked about the old bridge pilings that stick from the bank near the bend. She reportedly replied that the pilings belonged to a logging ramp that washed out when storms changed the channel 2 winters back. She did not recall him stepping into the water or walking the gravel bar to test the footing. State records list a cloud front moving in from the northwest with cooler air that sometimes makes breath show at dusk. A ranger out of Sisters wrote that the creek often looks tame until a beaver dam upstream lets a pulse slide through. That can raise water a few inches quickly, which becomes meaningful in a narrow crossing where tires already press wet stones. The ranger did not say this happened that night, only that such pulses occur without sound along that reach. The first missing person alert does not exist in the county file from 2009, though later forms reference an original call. One deputy said the form might have been faxed to a non-emergency line that stopped accepting overnight traffic. Another deputy thought a visitor probably dialed from near the highway and hit the wrong jurisdiction due to the tower skip. The absence of a timestamp feeds the theory that information arrived in pieces and never landed in a single folder. 2 anglers claimed they saw a dome light blinking near the ford sometime after dark while the truck sat angled to the bank. They argued about whether the engine idled or whether they only heard water sliding against stones under the alders. Some locals claimed a third person approached the scene on a bicycle and left without speaking, though investigators never confirmed such a rider. Their statements match on the dome light detail and diverge on almost every other point. Avery's sister later provided archived notes from his phone bills that show attempts to call a Ben number around 8. The number belongs to the cabin owner who had already driven home to Redmond and silenced his ringer above the garage. Records conflict on whether a voicemail ever arrived because the carrier log shows activity while the device log shows only a missed call. The discrepancy is small yet meaningful when trying to place a voice in a narrow hour along the creek. Searchers walked both banks at first light and found boot tracks that entered from the gravel bar and faded where cobble turned firm. A tape measure and a photograph shows a stride that stays even then shortens near a shallow channel cut by the previous week rain. They recovered the white cooler 50 yards downstream, caught against willow roots, with the lid unlatched but nothing inside. The jacket remained on the passenger seat exactly as Collins described, which adds a quiet weight to her timeline. A retired deputy who reviews Coldfield files said the map grid for the initial sweep sits 1 square too far east. He blamed a habit of copying last season templates during busy weeks and missing small shifts in volunteer practice. That oversight pushes a key waypoint off the creek, which could explain why a thermal search missed a figure in the brush. He did not frame this as proof that someone waited there, only that the error changed where people looked first. In later interviews, a hardware clerk in Sisters remembered Avery buying a short toe strap and a shovel with a fiberglass handle. The clerk thought he mentioned a soft approach near a ford where ruts filled and needed a few minutes with a blade. The receipt time lines up with Collins and the Ranger notes, which places him near the creek before dusk with reasonable tools. The purchase does not prove a crossing attempt, yet it keeps the possibility within a narrow band of motives. A volunteer firefighter described a call that almost arrived, a carrier ping that appears in a phone report but not in dispatch logs. He said the station door was open for inventory and the tone speakers clicked once without the usual follow message. He wrote his memory down years later for a training handout, which makes it more story than record. Still, several younger volunteers say they heard similar clicks during that month when the tower resets annoyed crews. Divers checked a pool downstream where the channel tightens and lifts small whirl lines against a rock rib under the bank. Visibility stayed poor due to fine silt stirred by a mid-morning wind and a brief flow rise from upstream wetlands. They found no clothing or wallet and no keys, which matches the detail that the truck cab stayed unlocked at the scene. The diver lead said the bottom felt mostly smooth with scattered roots that would have caught a heavy object easily. Weeks later, a property survey crew flagged a scrap of fabric trapped on barbed wire near a floodplain meadow. The piece looked like work pant material and carried fine silt that stains in the specific way Bridge Creek water does. A lab in Salem could not confirm much beyond weave and color range, which overlaps with common brands used by local contractors. The finding neither closes the case nor clears any doubts about the unrecorded call that started the confusion. Avery's truck eventually left the impound lot and returned to family after a modest court order that resolved a storage dispute. The odometer reading suggested little movement beyond the approach and the short angle found by deputies at first light. Tire pressure on the right front ran low enough to pull a light vehicle toward the wet edge during a cautious attempt. A mechanic said that detail matters only if a driver felt rushed and chose not to air up before crossing. Some residents claimed he might have walked out before midnight after losing patience with the patchy calls and weak signal near the ford. Others said a car picked him up on the highway and drove north toward Warm Springs, a route that thins quickly after dark. Investigators never confirmed either thread because camera coverage along that stretch remains limited and cash purchases leave quiet trails. The two stories survive because neither collides with the evidence found by the creek. Years after the search, a regional auditor reviewed communications procedures and noted that inter-county coordination improved during the next season. The report mentions additional training with tower vendors and a shared checklist when pings show cross-jurisdiction drift for emergency calls. None of that resolves where Avery went, yet it addresses the blank square where his first alert should have lived. The lesson sits quietly in meeting minutes while the creek keeps moving stones along the shallows. The file remains open in a narrow sense with periodic review when new hikers report odd finds in willow tangles after spring runoff. Most of those reports fade after a deputy drives out and looks where grass has already leaned and lifted again. The absence of a recovered body keeps speculation tethered to polite voices in diners near the highway and the mill. The story persists because the paperwork gap made a simple night on a small creek feel like an argument that never ends. The stories. The librarian who reopened maps after one voicemail. The voicemail hit the library phone system at 9:16 in the morning, and staff noted the time on the call sheet. The town's map room had been shuttered since 2016 for budget reasons, with the keys sealed in a gray envelope. Rhea Calder was 38 and worked as a reference librarian, and she was supposed to weed duplicate travel guides. She liked lists and quiet projects that finished by closing time, and she intended to be home before the streetlights switched on. She opened the staff mailbox for routine messages, and the new voicemail had a subject line that looked wrong. The timestamp matched today, yet the voice sounded grainy and old, like cassette tape found in a hot attic. The caller sounded rushed but clear, and he used a steady dispatcher tone that carried through the static. He said the emergency detour map in the bridge packet had its north arrow wrong, and the depot road turn would strand drivers. He named two intersections locals would recognize, and he said the paper copy got flipped during a late night duplication. He asked whoever heard this to check the flat files in the public map room, and then he hung up fast. Rhea paused because the library was planning a small display for the bridge reopening next week. The town crew wanted visitors to see old blueprints and printed maps, and the staff had quietly promised to unseal the room. She replayed the message and wrote down every location, and she typed the intersections into the library catalog notes. The bridge packet sat behind the desk in a manila folder, and she slipped the detour sheet out with a quiet tug. The detour looked normal at first glance, and the label fonts matched the county style guide. The north arrow pointed toward the top of the page, and a thick red line wrapped through three turns like a ribbon. She looked for a small staff stamp, and there it was near the border in faint purple. It said copied from firehouse drawer after warehouse incident, which the old reference notebook linked to 2009. Her job and training lived in the overlaps between paper and people, and she felt the old itch to confirm. The warehouse incident had clogged the streets for days, and archived calls reportedly mentioned bad directions at least twice. She brought the folder to the workroom and pulled the microfilm drawer, and the metal slides rasped against old paint. Dispatch logs on film listed closed streets and detours, and operators marked trouble points with pencil circles. Two logs from the same night mentioned Depot Road, and the note said trucks turned the wrong way toward the river. One line said, "See temporary detour plate beside flat file B," which sounded like a direct breadcrumb. Flat file B waited in the locked room behind the genealogy shelves, and the envelope with the keys lived in a safe. She signed a paper acknowledging responsibility for access, and she carried the keys with both hands like a relic. The map room smelled like dust and linen, and the ceiling fan ticked from a loose blade. She slid open a drawer and found rolled sheets, and brittle plastic sleeves stuck to their neighbors like leaves after rain. The temporary detour plate was a stiff board with a taped photocopy, and someone had written mirror warning in grease pencil. The north arrow had a big X over it, and a second arrow pointed to the right side with the word up. She spread the board on a table and placed washers on the corners, and the paper fought to curl back into memory. The depot road turn looked reversed compared to the packet, and the red line as drawn would lead drivers into gravel. Her phone compass showed north toward the windows, and the temporary plate matched her reading within a few degrees. The packet map disagreed by a wide margin, and her stomach tightened like it always did when details misbehaved. She printed a recent aerial photo from the county website, and she centered on Depot Road and the bridge approach. A water tower shadow ran northeast by the clock, and that matched the plate, but not the packet. She called Tomas Brink, who was 54 and ran maintenance, and she asked about the packet source. He said a volunteer scanned old map holders in the spring, and staff patched labels onto the county base. He remembered a late-night copy job at the firehouse during the warehouse week, and he thought someone flipped a master. He had no hard proof, but he told her to talk with a retired cartographer who lived near the marsh. The cartographer was named Lyda Morell, and she was 71 with careful eyes and a faded canvas jacket. Lyda said she had drawn the original emergency plates on Mylar, and she always sketched north as a small star. Lyda remembered the night the plates went missing, and she spoke like a teacher marking a board after a test. The firehouse copier worked only on the legal tray that night, and someone fed the plate upside down, then pressed copy twice. Lita said her handwriting on the board looked like her early notes, and she pointed to the grease pencil word up. She kept a photo from that week that showed two volunteers holding the board outside, and the sun angle matched. Rhea asked if the board ever returned to the library, And Lida shrugged like she had told the story several times. She said yes, the board came back 2 days later, and someone tucked it into drawer B and shut the room. Ria documented everything as if the board could grow legs and escape, and she wrote dates beside each step. She took photos of the board and the packet, and she copied the microfilm lines, and she initialed each printed page. The voicemail still bothered her because the timestamp said today, yet the content smelled like an old headache. She checked the library phone system logs, and a vendor note explained a recent server migration for stored voicemail. An alert said a batch of delayed messages had been flushed to mailboxes, and the explanation used dry language and disclaimers. She asked the vendor to search for the caller number, and they returned an old service name with a billing code. The code matched a dispatch line used during the warehouse week, which explained the voice and the choice of words. Someone had recorded this warning years ago, and the system had kept it like a seed in a jar. Rhea asked if the caller name could be released, and the vendor sent a redacted sheet with initials and a job title. A local news archive matched the initials to a night guard who reportedly died of natural causes in his parked car. The guard had phoned the correction before the medical event, and he had tried to reach any desk that could fix the map. His message never reached a human while the roads were jammed, and the bad copy camped in a drawer. Ria brought her notes to Tomas, and he carried the folder to a brief meeting with the town clerk. The clerk asked for confirmations and a plan, and Ria offered a clear sequence that would be easy to retrace next year. Step 1 was to treat the packet map as untrustworthy and to replace it with a fresh export from the county base. Step 2 was to reconcile the arrow with on-site compass readings and to annotate with the date and the staff initials. Step 3 was to scan the temporary board and let the grease pencil speak and to place its image in the appendix. Step 4 was to add a small note in the bridge display and to credit anonymous archival materials for clarifying the route. Tomas drove to Depot Road with her after lunch, and they parked near a mailbox whose nameplate had peeled away. The river ran dull and brown beside the road, and a detour sign leaned like a tired person after a long shift. Ria stood where the red line on the packet would have sent traffic, and she looked through cottonwoods at rough gravel. The correct route followed a narrow paved lane to the east, and the wrong turn aimed drivers toward a soft shoulder. A school bus rolled past on the narrow lane, and the driver waved like this was already muscle memory. The aerial photo printed in the morning matched the bus path, and the packet map did not. They stopped by a small clinic 2 turns away, and the nurse behind the counter remembered the warehouse week. The clinic took calls from stranded drivers, and a nurse reportedly walked out to redirect a line of cars at sundown. The town clerk approved the correction that afternoon, and the county uploaded a clean detour with verified arrows. Tomas signed off on new signs, and the bridge crew shrugged like this was just another Tuesday with wet concrete. Ria asked for permission to open the map room weekly, and the clerk looked toward the budget with a careful tilt. The request had no funding yet, but the clerk liked the argument that open rooms produce fewer expensive mistakes. They agreed on a one-afternoon schedule under staff supervision, and Ria posted a notice near the staircase. She placed the temporary board in a display case with a modest label, and she kept the packet map below it with a sticky note. The sticky note said obsolete and see corrected version, and she included the date and her initials for future sanity. A footnote in the display explained that a delayed voicemail triggered the review and no personal names appeared. At the reopening of the bridge, the mayor shook hands and cut a ribbon, and the appetizers ran out fast. Drivers moved through the new approach like water down a smooth bed, and the detour signs wandered into storage. Tomas clapped her shoulder near the coffee urn, and he said, "Quiet fixes rarely get banners, which is the point." Lida visited the display the next morning, and she pressed her fingers against the glass like she was reading Braille. Rhea listened to the old voicemail one more time, and the voice had that tired confidence that comes from night work. He had said, "Please check the flat files," and it felt like he was speaking across a hallway rather than across years. On her desk, she kept a small notebook with 3 lines that she repeated when projects became slippery. Write down names of things as they are used, compare them to how they look on paper, test the direction with the Sunday. She added a fourth line in light ink to mark the lesson that felt both new and as old as maps. If a voice says the arrow is wrong, open the drawer before the parade trucks roll and the cameras arrive. In the months that followed, the room gathered quiet visitors, and the fan still ticked, but less often after tightening. Folks brought rolled plats from garages, and Ria labeled them carefully, then scanned and returned them with fresh sleeves. A contractor volunteered 2 hours a week to help with filing, and he taught her to spot scale bars that lied. Teachers brought students to trace creeks with cotton thread, and one kid noticed a benchmark star on the courthouse steps. The bridge display came down after the season changed, and the temporary board went back into drawer B with a proper sleeve. A small typed note inside the sleeve told the story in 12 lines, with dates and initials and measured claims. It said a voicemail arrived and matched earlier dispatch references, and staff verified the arrow with compass and aerial evidence. It said a clean map replaced the packet version before the reopening, and the town's roads agreed. Ria did not call it a miracle, and she did not call it fate, because both words would cheapen 12 careful steps. She called it library work, which sounded plain, yet it held more weight now that a ribbon had been cut. On quiet afternoons, she stood at the window where the compass had pointed, and she felt the same small pull. North was where the light made honest shapes on paper, and where a tired voice could still find the right room. When she locked the door each week, she thought about the man who made the call, and she wished he had been heard. His warning crossed an odd gap in the system, and it landed like a folded note slid under a door. In a town where stories often arrive secondhand, the plain ones sometimes carry the longest mileage. One message, one board, one arrow corrected, and a room reopened so a drawer could be opened without ceremony. The stories. Night Guard, who followed footprints beyond the bridge. The first prints showed on a cold night when the river smoked and the closed bridge let out a slow iron groan. Frost held the gravel in a crust, so every step someone took across the municipal yard snapped like thin glass. Merrick Holland worked nights because he liked quiet places and because the warehouse paid overtime when storms rolled in. He was 41 by the last week of January, and he kept his thermos on the dash while he did his rounds. His plan was simple that night. Check the north fence. Check the generator shed. Sign the log before dawn and head home on the empty road. He saw the prints on his second pass, and their path made little sense when he stood still to study them. The footprints curved toward the pedestrian bridge that crossed the narrow river, which had been closed since late autumn while crews waited on parts. A chain link panel barred the entrance with a sign that warned about unsafe decking, and Marek knew the sign by heart. He radioed the dispatcher with a routine note, since procedure made repeaters of careful guards. He kept his words easy. He said there were footprints where there should be none, and that he would check closer. The reply was scratchy and bored, and Merrick almost laughed at the familiar tone. The treads were small and tidy, like work boots with a diamond pattern, and each step pressed the frost to a dark oval. The prints went right up to the chain link panel, then slipped under at a low spot where someone had pulled wire loose. Merrick knelt and touched the ground, and cold shot through his glove while he reset the bent ties. He peered down the dark shape of the bridge and decided he would not walk out there in the cold wind, not without telling someone first. He called again, then kept his flashlight tight to the decking while he stepped forward, and he felt the bridge vibrate under his boots. He moved slow because he always moved slow when he could choose between slow and fast. Halfway across, the prints turned to powder as the frost thinned, and he had to scan both sides for scuffs on the gray boards. He found a faint line where grit had dragged, like something heavy had been pulled by rope. On the far side, the deck ended at a set of concrete steps that dropped to the river path, and here the prints deepened again. They pointed left, past an old pipe cradle and a low stand of scrub willow. Reports in the fall had mentioned fishers along the bank after hours, which was normal, and a few had been moved along without trouble. A clerk at the gas station had told an officer that a man bought batteries and duct tape in the same visit, which was normal enough, though people sometimes remember strange details when asked at night. Dispatch logs showed power dips near the intake station from time to time, and maintenance had chalked that up to loose connections in cold weather. Marek followed the prints along the river path until they vanished near a patch of bare gravel that the sun struck most days, even in winter. He stood there and listened. Somewhere upstream, an owl made three soft calls, and a semi rolled past on the highway with a roar that shook the willow branches. He decided he had gone far enough for one night. He photographed the prints on his phone and headed back, and he wrote a careful note in the log before dawn. By the next shift, the frost lifted late, and the yard lights burned a clean white circle on the gravel. Merrick checked the generator shed first and noticed something he could not shake. The small lock on the diesel cap was scuffed, and a scratch ran from the cap to the lip like a hose had rubbed while someone steadied a weight. He checked the fuel slip from the last delivery and did the quick math. The level looked low by a few gallons, which could happen, and which also could not. He spoke with Celia Karp in maintenance the following afternoon because Celia knew more about the place than anyone in the office. Celia was 58 and had worked 3 floods and 2 droughts, and she kept a pocket notebook with every code for every panel. She said the power dips had been shrugged off by city, and that nobody had time to pull the panels until spring. She said the bridge closure made her nervous because blocked paths invite shortcuts. On the third night, Marek went to the bridge before his first pass, and he crouched at the chain link panel with a small bag of sidewalk chalk from the supply closet. He rubbed a pinch of red chalk into the dirt under the gap and dusted the decking where the prints had scuffed before. He wanted a way to tell if someone crossed again, and he wanted to see where the dust went when the night did its work. He made his rounds slower than usual and kept his eyes on corners where things hide without trying. The radio remained quiet until midnight. Then a call came in about a coyote by the south gate. Marek drove down and found only wind, and he thought the call felt like a joke he had heard before. He logged it anyway, because logs are the bones of quiet jobs. When he returned to the bridge, his light caught the faintest red sunset on the boards, and he felt alert in the way he liked. The chalk had smeared in a thin line toward the far steps, and the dust trailed down to the river path. On the gravel, small red flecks marked an arc that led behind a stack of old culvert pipe where few people bothered to look. He moved closer and found a cooler wedged inside a culvert mouth, and an inverter buzzed inside like a tired hornet. A length of clear hose lay coiled by the cooler, and the nozzle had a strip of duct tape where a leak had been patched. The setup looked temporary and careful, like someone trusted routine more than luck. Marek called dispatch, and his voice stayed even while he chose words that would not set hairs on necks. An officer drove down the service road and met him by the culvert, and they stood and listened together. The officer did not rush, which Marek respected, and the two men watched the bridge until the wind shifted. The officer said he would put a note on the morning brief, and he asked Marek to keep eyes open without playing hero. The phrase made Marek smile, and later he did not tell that part to anyone. In the days after, Marek traced the quiet pattern that repeats when someone abuses access. He checked camera angles and discovered the North Yard camera had been bumped on a date that matched a power dip, and the new angle showed the sky more than the gate. He opened the back of the housing and found 3 screws missing, which was always a tell. He measured the footprints with a scrap of tape and got the same length each time, which told him the walker was careful with steps or else was one person always. He walked to the diner 2 blocks away during the afternoon and chatted with the cook named Huxley, who knew every vehicle that rolled through after midnight. Huxley said a man in a dark jacket sat late 2 nights a week, always with a single cup of coffee and a pocket radio on the booth seat. Huxley said the man tipped exact change and left when the freight trains crossed the river, which happened near the time Marion Street patrol cars swapped shifts. At the yard, a temporary guard from an agency had been filling 2 nights that Mark traded away for overtime on weekends. The temp signed the log with 2 letters and a quick crooked line. The initials were H and P, which matched about 1,000 people and which could match none. Merrick did not care for suspicion as a hobby, yet he did not care for coincidences when fuel levels fell in quiet inches. He sat in his sedan before shift and went through old notes in his glove box where he kept manuals and photocopies. A contractor named Deacon Varelli had lost access in 2017 after a billing fight, and his crew had worked the intake station on that very river path for years. Merrick wrote the name on a small card, then tossed the card at once, because names can lead you down the wrong hall. He kept his attention on the temp schedule instead, and he compared logs against the chalk nights and the reported coyote calls. On a dry Tuesday, red chalk showed again on the gravel, and the cooler in the culvert had moved 2 feet, which looked like a nervous person trying to outsmart the obvious. Marek called the non-emergency number and asked for a quiet presence, and officers waited with their lights low behind the old salt shed. Marek did his rounds with wide loops and checked his watch without seeming to check, and he waited on the near side of the bridge by the chain link panel. A figure came over the crest like a shadow that had business, and the boots set down in precise little ovals. The man wore a dark jacket with reflective piping like the agency issued, and he carried a duffel that sagged from weight. Merrick stepped forward and kept his light on the ground, and he spoke steady without trying to sound like an actor. He said the bridge was closed by order of city, and he asked if help was needed. The man froze and looked left toward the culvert, which told Marek the only thing he really needed to know. The officers stepped from behind the shed, and everything stayed dull and true from there. The duffel held a 12-volt pump, a power bank, and 2 hoses cut to different lengths. The cooler held the inverter and spare tape and a stack of empty hand warmers, which can keep batteries alive just long enough between dips. The generator diesel cap carried the same tape residue as the hose, which tied the loop neatly enough for any careful mind. In the report that later circulated, details sat plain without flourish, which is how such documents talk to the world. The temp guard was named Harley Pruitt, age 36, and he had worked a roster of small night jobs that rewarded boredom more than skill. Archived calls showed he had reported animal movement at the south gate on the nights when the pump likely ran, which kept eyes away from the river path. Store security footage from across the highway reportedly showed a man matching his build, buying duct tape and batteries on a schedule that matched power dips at the intake station. Celia came down with a wrench the following morning and replaced the generator cap, and she tightened every panel on every camera while humming through her teeth. She shook Merrick's hand with hard gratitude, and she told him the thing she always tells the new ones. Quiet places are never empty, and attention is the difference between a close call and a cleanup. People in town talked for a day, and then they talked about weather and games and a boat stuck on the ramp. Merrick logged his shift and ran a cloth across the dusty dash, and he looked once at the bridge where the chain link panel still hung crooked. He felt a small weight lift, which felt almost like pride, and then he felt something more like relief. He went back to the prints in his head, and he ran the path out again from the first night to the last. The steps had led beyond the bridge in the way tracks tell their whole story, and the red chalk had given him a quiet mouth. He thought about the way a small problem can hide in